All right, and then
All right, welcome to everyone joining. We'll start in about 3 to 4 minutes. If you're just joining, put in the comments where you're joining from. We always love to see kind of the national representation ODsonFinance has, so feel free to share that. All right, we got the South represented. Really got the South represented.
I went to Hermitage yesterday.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So now I know all about Andrew Jackson.
Got a New York presence, and okay, we got a West Coaster, Oregon. There we go. All right, welcome to everyone joining. Yeah, feel free to leave in the comments where you're joining from. We will start in about 3 to 4 minutes.
Kentucky, huh?
Right, the Derby. That too, in Bourbon. Somewhere in California and Washington. Good old Nashville. Fort Worth, home of Alcon. Yeah. Or one of their facilities, at least. Awesome. Bay Area, yeah. All right, we're going to start in a couple of minutes for people just funneling in. Feel free to put in the comments where you're coming from, and we'll begin shortly.
Great.
North Carolina, nice. We all had to take boards. Yeah. You remember that, Dad?
What?
Part 3 in North Carolina.
Oh,
back in the day.
There's apparently no happy hour in North Carolina.
Yeah.
Sup, David? All right, perfect. It's 9 o'clock.
Well, it is 9 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I know people are still funneling in, so let's go ahead and jump right into it so that we can be respectful of your time. I know it's Memorial Day weekend. I appreciate everyone that's joining us. I know a lot of people are going to be joining afterwards since they're out of town for the weekend, so we do appreciate you coming. Just want to run through a few announcements, and then we'll jump right into the CE lecture. Number 1, we have partnered with CSI to bring you billing and coding services, so definitely take a look at that. Scan the QR code to the right on the slide. I use them personally. I've used them for 7 years, and they've been fantastic in just saving me money, helping me build up revenue on the medical side of my practice. So they do everything: billing services, compliance programs, credentialing, chart review, everything. And they actually have a remote service that does your billing for you. They can actually go into your EMR and actually do it remotely. So it's pretty awesome. So definitely check them out if you're looking for something along those lines for your practice. And the job board, we thought it was going to be launched in May 15. We ran into a few snags. We want to make this thing as perfect as possible. We know there's a lot of job boards out there that aren't too great, and we don't want to be one of those. We want it to be different, and we want it to really serve our community. So new target launch date is somewhere in June, and once again, the same features as what we mentioned before. And if you do have some student loans to refi, our latest announcement is we have struck a deal with Laurel Road, and you can use your AOA discount in addition to what we have to offer. So it's fantastic for members to utilize and scan the QR code right there if you're looking to refinance your student loans. And with that being said, we're just going to hear from a couple of our sponsors, and then we're going to jump into Ben's lecture. So I'm going to call on Parita first. Parita is our fantastic healthcare broker. She's helped so many ODs in our community get affordable healthcare insurance. And she's going to do a little presentation on what she does. So Parita, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I am very excited to be here. I am going to share my screen so I can show you guys everything I put together for you. So let me just move this and push the play button. Okay, so a little bit about me. My name is Karita Patel. I've actually been working with the ODsFinance group since the beginning of the year. My younger brother is a radiology resident and my sister is an optometrist. So I'm one of the few Patels on this side of the healthcare world. But ever since I entered the insurance world, I definitely knew one thing, which is there's a very unfortunate lack of education when it comes to insurance, both for individuals and families and employers. So my hope in the next 3 minutes is to, by the time I'm done with this, you guys will all be experts on what all the health insurance options are. So when it comes to health insurance, you have a lot of different kinds. When I joined this world, I also learned that there was pet insurance, but that's not my specialty. But there's definitely a lot of different kinds out there. And unfortunately, we do need most of them because it's better to have it and not need it than end up needing it and not having it. But I'm going to talk about individual options, family options, as well as group plans for employees, because I know when it comes to providing benefits for your team, that's something that's a big priority for a lot of practice owners. So now, what are the main options when it comes to insurance? We've got a couple that are probably more familiar than others, but the biggest one that everybody usually knows about is the Marketplace, also known as ACA Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. That's going to be the biggest one across the US. Now, those plans are major medical coverage, which means anyone and everyone can get on a plan regardless of any pre-existing conditions. That's great if you have a lot of pre-existing conditions, not necessarily if you don't and you're relatively healthy, because prices tend to reflect exactly that. Because if you come in with a lot of expenses, essentially premiums are bloated to be able to cover people's expenses, if that makes sense. So unless you're low income also, it doesn't necessarily make sense to always go in an Obamacare route. But that is the biggest option available. You've probably heard of short-term insurance. Usually it's really meant to bridge a gap in between situations, like if we're transitioning from one employer to another, but that does exist as well. There is something called health share options, also known as Christian ministries. As much as they're trying to upgrade those, I know that right on the front page of a brochure, it says this is not real health insurance. So that's just something to be aware of. And then there's private insurance. I do spend the bulk of my time on private, although I have access to everything else that exists, but private is something that is based on health. So for people that are relatively healthy, they can essentially qualify for better care. It's like being rewarded on your car insurance for being a safe driver. So essentially you have the option of private if you are relatively healthy. Now, I wanted to pull together just an example of what a family of 4 plan would look like from an Obamacare Marketplace option, just so you guys can see what is out there. So what I pulled for you, for a family of 4, we're looking at people in their mid 40s and 2 kids. The cheapest possible plan from a Blue Cross option was $2,300 a month, which is kind of a mortgage, if not worse, because that's pretty expensive from a monthly premium standpoint for 4 people. You see the family deductible is almost $14,000, and over to the right, everything says no charge after deductible. So not only are you paying, $2,300 a month for your health insurance, but you're paying full price for everything else until you meet that deductible. And when I broke the plan down a little bit further, I know this is really small, I'm sorry for the screen, but you could see next to primary care visit, specialist visit, preventative is free, but everything else you see full price until the deductible is met. So also, if you're looking at from a hospital standpoint, if we have to go to urgent care, the emergency room, you have to use an ambulance, all the things that we want to make sure our insurance protects us in, you're still paying full price for everything until you meet that very high deductible. After the deductible, things are free. Pregnancy and birth, same thing applies. I'm getting repetitive now. Now, the one thing that's great about these plans is that you have free preventative care. So, we love that. Preventative is your yearly wellness, vaccinations, and that's pretty much it. Now, I did want to show the gold version of this plan, or I'm sorry, it's the silver version of this plan, and that's about $3,000 a month, and it's an HMO plan as well, so I'll talk about that in a second. But here you do have a lower deductible. You still have a pretty high max out of pocket, but now you're paying $3,000 a month, and you still have co-pays for your doctor's visits, as opposed to it being full price. So it's kind of a trade-off here. If you look for something with slightly better benefits or deductibles, usually you're paying way more monthly as well. So hopefully all of that makes sense. Now, Alternative options, I do want to spend more time on private and ACA than the other two, just because I don't really recommend those unless it is for a very short period of time, referring to the short-term and the health share plans. But a little bit about private insurance, just so you guys are aware of how that works. First of all, you have PPO coverage, which gives you nationwide coverage. So no matter where you're set up in the US, your insurance actually travels with you, as opposed to Obamacare Marketplace, which are mostly HMO and EPO. And sometimes it's hard to even go to the doctors that you love because barely anybody accepts it. So that's one thing that's great. And then there are customizable options. So this is applying for whether employee benefits or for your family, but you could access short-term disability, dental, vision. Obviously, we don't need vision. Telemedicine's included, accidental death and dismemberment, critical illness, life insurance. So very customizable based on what you want to offer to your team or your family. And there are no open enrollment periods for private insurance either. This could be something you switch to at any time of the year. Only thing is they are health-based. So not necessarily everybody can qualify for a plan. So it's known as major medical type. Now, with that being said, they're medically underwritten, just kind of like life insurance. Although life insurance, you probably have to get blood work done and things like that. For this, they're going to pull medical records for somebody before they can get approved. No major pre-existing conditions, any big heart disease issues, diabetes, cancer. And there's a few things that it doesn't cover, including maternity. So that's how they're able to keep their costs low. And if I was to actually pull the exact family's quote on a private plan, it does end up being $1,232 a month. So major difference, obviously a whole $1,000 cheaper than what I showed you on the original slide, but just wanted to make sure people are aware of what options are out there. Now, obviously, you guys as employers, you're wanting to first and foremost attract and retain top talent. These days, especially the younger generations, mine included, loyalty is one thing, but everyone just wants what's best for them. So being able to offer great benefits to your team is definitely a big piece of it. So when it comes to providing something for your employees, you have 3 directions you could go. There's something known as SHOP, which is basically the Obamacare Marketplace plan version of employee group plans. There's private insurance, which is what I just described, and then you can work with a local agent. So that's information there. Now, the only thing about private is there are some state limitations. So every state has its own set of rules when it comes to insurance. I know that the private companies are working really hard to touch some of these grayed out states that do have some of those restrictions. Obviously, I want to do what's best for my clients because I do get to become a benefits manager if I work with you. And if we can work around restrictions, of course, I'm open to it. But again, I just want to do what's best for everybody. So and that's kind of everything. So hopefully that was a very quick, short and sweet version of health insurance. If you would like to learn more information, I am here for you guys. I would love to be whatever resource you need. And I did put steps to working with me. I want to assess the situation, see if I'm able to help and, answer any questions I can. We can book a 15-minute call and take any next steps. But back to you guys. I hope that was helpful and short.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Parita. And yeah, make sure to reach out to her if you have any questions on health insurance or if this is something that you're interested in. And right here, you can scan that QR code as well. If you don't want to type anything into your browser, simply scan that and that'll jump over to her website. So once again, Parita, thank you. And she'll be staying on the comment section if there's any questions on the chat. And then let's move on to our next sponsor, and that is Eric Matai and Acrinos. I've known Eric for a couple of years now. He's an absolutely fantastic person. He's got so much energy and just so much drive, and he is here to just bring results to your private practice. Whether you're first starting out or you just need someone to help out in the consultation, Eric is here for you. So Eric, I'm gonna let you take the floor.
Dr. Neufeld, thank you so much. And, thank you for creating a platform for doctors to come together to explore what is a really hot topic right now for doctors across the span of the life cycle of the practice. So to best kind of serve up, this idea of, for everyone that's viewing this program, that's coming here to understand more about options with their exit strategy, the goal here that I thought over these next few minutes would really be all about where to go from here, right? So doctors, viewers, again, no matter where you are in your process of everywhere from perhaps step one of just like initially planning your exit strategy to perhaps you're actually starting to really actively find opportunities. From our perspective, in the work we do and helping doctors truly thrive in this modern healthcare environment, and realizing that it's really all about helping doctors achieve their professional and personal goals in private practice, and whether it's working with emerging practice owners or established practice owners. And that really is what brings us to what today is all about, right? So over the course of the next couple of hours, between Dr. Chudner's conversation that he's going to lead, and then the roundtable that Natalie has pulled together, we're going to be hit with a whole lot of info, right? Pertaining to one of a variety of options that may be available to you when planning your exit, whether that is private equity, whether that is the doctor to doctor transition, perhaps working with an ophthalmology group and some larger scope, or selling your practice to a network or otherwise. But really, my question for all of you here today is, what's next, right? What is next for you? Because in the conversation that follows, we're going to be exposed to concepts like EBITDA, like cash flow, like net income, like the role of compliance in planning the exit strategy. But I would encourage everyone to realize that what is manifesting here in these numbers, realize that at the end of the day, there are operations and there's implementation within your practice that has direct correlation into what these numbers are going to look like from a valuation standpoint. So in that regard, I would invite you all to consider where you're going to go from here and to go for it. Okay. So I'm going to share with you all briefly just our approach that we take in helping clients, no matter how big or how small the need is. And it's going to start with this, right? Analyze. Every decision you make for your business must be data informed. And that being said, there are three core practice or analytics that you're going to want to involve in your decision making. Certainly practice level analytics, industry trends, and other internal priorities. Once you have a better understanding of what is driving those numbers, then it's a matter of developing a strategy that can go about impacting those numbers. And the key to this is a three-pillared, we call it a stakeholder-centric strategy. And it's really all about how you're going to empower your people to drive change in your practice. What decisions and changes are you making in your practice to better delight patients, perhaps impacting their spend in your practice? And obviously, at the end of the day, ensuring that any strategy that's being put forth is certainly going to have an impact on the bottom line of the practice. And then last but not least is implementation. And that's all about having an effective and agile implementation. So assign your change champions in your practice. Who is that person? Not always the office manager. Who is that person that is going to be responsible for driving change in the practice? Obviously, establishing SMART goals and follow up to drive that change. Now, if you find yourself looking at the opportunity available to you and wanting to drive that change, you're probably going to find you're in one of three categories, right? And that is, hey, I'm looking at my practice and I know there's a lot of areas that I could improve things, pull things together to better position my practice for sale. Or perhaps number two, perhaps you are that highly motivated doctor with the highly engaged team and you have identified some goals, but still looking for some structure and some accountability around that. And third, last but not least, is maybe you have identified exactly what you need to change in your practice, but again, needing that support and that accountability to see that change through. And when you put all that together, that really is what we are in the business of doing, is providing consulting solutions that are going to deliver results no matter your stage of practice lifecycle. And while it's great to be here, I will remind everyone that I am but one little small piece of this larger organization that is Acrinos. And we've got a ton of talent on the team. We all share in this same vision of providing innovative solutions to help doctors achieve their goals. So if coming away from today's meeting, you are reflecting on the opportunity available for you to perhaps better position your practice as an attractive option for a private equity group, or no matter what your exit strategy may be, please do reach out. We'd love to learn more and perhaps share some ways that we can help you bring that practice value to the next level. So thank you so much. Enjoy the conversation. Dr. Chudner, thank you for being here. Natalie, thank you for organizing today's roundtable, and have a great meeting.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Eric, for that great presentation. And once again, if you do want to reach out to Eric, feel free to scan that QR code right there. He's fantastic, a wealth of knowledge and also a lot of energy. So he will definitely put you on the right path. All right, and so we are now going to jump into the CE portion of our day today. And we're going to have Dr. BenjaminChudner talk, and I'm going to give a quick introduction for him in just a little bit. But before we do, I want to go through just a few things for our COPE-approved CE. And I see that all our panelists are on right now. So we will be starting the panel in about 50 minutes to an hour. So panelists, if you want to log off for a little bit, that's perfectly fine. Just come back on in an hour. All right, so reminders. I don't think we'll have any live poll questions, but if they do pop up, make sure to answer them. There's going to be a survey after this whole event is done and you're logged off. And so make sure to fill that out. That really helps us with how we can create content for you in the future. You got to be present during the entire hour to receive credit. And CE certificates will be sent out in about 3 to 4 weeks after the event. And if you have any issues with connectivity or just anything at all, feel free to email us, admin@ODsonFinance.com. And one thing I forgot to mention at the beginning is we will have a raffle at the very end after the CE event and after the roundtable for a $100 Amazon gift card. So make sure to stay for that. But without further ado, I do want to introduce our speaker. So Dr. Chudner is a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley School of Optometry. Shortly after graduation, he acquired an independent optometry practice in Bremerton, Washington. Dr. Chudner was able to build a highly successful practice and team and ultimately sold the business 10 years later. Since that time, Dr. Chudner has spent more than a decade in leadership roles at Bausch & Lomb and Luxottica Retail, where he most recently served as the Senior Clinical Director for North America. Dr. Chudner is an accomplished lecturer and trainer and an active member of several industry organizations, including the AOA, American Academy of Optometry, and the New York State Optometric Association. And currently he serves as Chief Medical Officer at Acuity Eye Care Group. And Ben has been a fantastic resource in ODsonFinance for the last 3 to 4 years. He's always helped with answering questions on PE and a variety of different subjects. We had the honor of meeting him back at Vision Expo East, and it was great to meet him in person, and we're happy to have him on live for this CE event. So Ben, I'm going to let you take over.
Awesome, thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen. There we go. So you should see it now. So thank you so much. I want to start off by thanking ODsonFinance for the opportunity to present this material to you. I actually wrote this a while ago. It became a hot topic really in 2018, 2019. I think it still continues to be a hot topic. But what happened was we were seeing a lot of presentations at Expo, and we were having people who claim to be experts in private equity talk, and I don't know that they're necessarily saying good or bad things, but they weren't necessarily accurate things. We had a bunch of moderated discussions, especially at East and West, where we had PE firms represented. And what was interesting is they managed to invite panelists on those that had not sold to PE and not the panelists that had sold to PE, which I always thought was interesting. I think you should see both sides of that. But basically, what you heard was people who regretted their decision or chose not to sell. So, the end result of this has been there's been a lot of misunderstanding about what private equity is and whether it's a good thing for our profession. I think that maybe will be discussed a little bit more on the panel. I won't spend a lot of time on that here, although I, of course, have my opinions. But before we go too far, I need to review my disclosure. So Acuity Eye Care Group was founded, which is now AEG Vision, was founded by Riata Capital, and it will be one of the private equity groups I'll discuss today. I do sit as the Chief Medical Officer of AEG Vision. As such, on the executive team, I do hold incentive units as well as my own investment shares in the company. But I'm not here to tell you my group is better than other groups. This will be a very generalized conversation about what private equity is. There is a lot of money being spent right now buying up practices. You'll see my goal is to help you decide if selling your practice to private equity is right for you. And really give you all the information about all the major players, which there are a lot of now, so you can decide for yourself how to proceed. For many of you, a sale to private equity is just not going to make sense. For those of you that do want to explore private equity as an option, though, it's important for you to understand the differences between the different firms and make the decision that best suits your objectives. We've certainly heard a lot of people online that say they were not happy with their decision or have friends that weren't happy with their decision. And ultimately, what we all want is when people choose to partner with us, that they are happy and this made an actual, this was a good thing for them. So we're going to go through, like I said, all these things. We'll talk through the key considerations when presented with the opportunity to sell your practice. We'll also talk about how valuations differ with private equity. I think that becomes very, very important. We'll look at what's going to be asked of you throughout the process, which of course you're going to want to know what integration after and life after close looks like. So these will be the objectives. And to that end, here's the agenda. What is private equity and why are they investing in optometry? Who are the major private equity backed optometry players? Is private equity right for me? How will your practice be valued? And what you can expect during diligence, integration, and post-close. And then we'll obviously have a little bit of time for Q&A, and then we have this panel. So we'll see how that all goes. So let's dig in. What is private equity and why are they investing in optometry? So private equity historically has kept a very, very low profile, largely by design. A typical private equity sponsor or fund will manage a large pool of capital from a range of institutional and high net worth investors, which are collectively known as limited partners. As competition has increased, though, private equity sponsors have become increasingly narrowed in their focus, and they focus on a limited number of industries where they have established track record of success. PE typically recapitalizes a company with the use of equity from their limited partners, as well as varying levels of debt from a traditional or non-traditional lender. And a typical PE sponsor will also have a defined investment horizon ranging 5 to 7 years, but they also have the option to extend beyond 10 years. And as you can see, these are not typically public. They are not publicly traded. That's the definition. They could be investors are large institutional investors, could be university endowments. I know we have a teacher's pension fund in ours, could be wealthy individuals. Sorry about that. They're known for extensive use of debt financing to purchase companies and restructuring in order to resell for higher value. No one knows, though, exactly how much capital has been committed to various PE funds, but everyone does agree that it's a massive number, and it's somewhere in the $4 to $6 trillion range. This has led to a dynamic where there's way too much capital chasing too few deals, which has been really good for optometry. And Fortune estimates there's about $1 trillion available to invest still. High valuations in the public equity sector in the past have pushed more money into PE. And in 2017 alone, going back a few years, last time we have data, $561 billion were raised, billion with a B. We're also seeing sovereign wealth funds come into play with Norway wanting to invest $1 trillion into private equity. And then with the stock market volatility, it's loosely correlated to the PE market. It does make it more challenging to secure debt financing, and investors can get spooked. And I apologize, I don't know why it's going forward here. Can get spooked. But when the stock market is overheated, analysts will say private equity acquisitions are especially attractive to investors looking to maximize return. So private equity firms follow a range of strategies, and I'll go through several of them here. Essentially, they almost all look to acquire a company, make operational improvements, and make acquisitions to drive accelerated growth. This can be done quickly because they have the cash on hand, which also gives them a competitive advantage. They don't have to worry about financing. They've already got the financing in place. The reason people sell is the present value proposition that PE creates. It's the ability to remove the management burdens of owning a business. Perhaps one of the biggest aspects of private equity strategies, though, is the alignment of interests across the organization. This comes in the form of equity reinvestment, so sellers can reinvest some of their equity, bonuses for the doctors hitting certain targets, and then enhancing operational efficiencies. As it relates to optometry, as well as many other industries, the name of the game, though, is consolidation. A private equity firm is going to look to establish a platform which they can continue to bolt on other companies or practices. These platforms will typically have a centralized back office functions, expertise that smaller single shingle offices simply will not have, like billing, RCM, credentialing, etc. As the platform gets larger and larger, their purchasing power continues to increase. And you guys see this all the time. Vision Source is a wonderful buying group. This works very similar. We build this large scale, so our buying power is huge. And that yields efficiencies in purchasing. And these efficiencies will increase the value of the total business. As far as exit strategies are concerned, a PE firm can choose to retain and grow the business or grow and divest it, which seems to be the most common strategy we see. Now, the bottom line is there's good PE and bad PE, speaking purely from an operational point of view. And you're going to want to partner with a firm that has a very solid management team that understands the ins and outs of integration. Many have tried to consolidate specific industries only to fail because they have underinvested in critical infrastructure to support further acquisitions. So why optometry and why now? Well, it's no secret that the U.S. vision care market is huge. In 2017 alone, it was estimated to be about $41 billion in revenue, and it's predicted to continue growing, especially as the population ages. Looking at the graph on the left, you can see the number of U.S. residents over the age of 65 is estimated to continue growing through 2050. As we all know, the incidence of common eye disorders increases with age. In addition, we know that adults over the age of 40 are more likely to require some sort of vision correction, whether it's for presbyopia or mild hyperopia, that's now becoming an issue at a distance. And in fact, the number of U.S. adults with presbyopia is predicted to reach 123 million by 2020. Now, if you look at the graph on the right, you can see that a number of patients with conditions such as cataracts, diabetic retinopathy, primary open-angle glaucoma, and macular degeneration are all up from 2010. In addition to disease, standard refractive error is another huge opportunity, with 75% of the population wearing some sort of corrective lenses. And now we hear a lot about the myopia epidemic. And just look at how many articles and lectures we now have on myopia control. All this to say, the potential opportunity to invest in optometry is enormous and very attractive. To further illustrate this, so let's take a look at closer at some of the reasons optometry is so attractive to PE. Not all these relate to purchasing practices, but rather why the industry is on their radar. Changing demographics. I mean, we have this digital explosion. It's not new now, but population lifestyles and personal care needs. As we look at specifically changing demographics, as I mentioned earlier, the aging population drives the need for ongoing care. Myopia management is now in the spotlight and appears to be the next big thing in optometry, if it isn't already. U.S. millennials are the #1 target demographic for services such as contact lenses, and their buying power continues to increase. Looking down the road, we'll see an increase in multicultural consumers driven largely by Hispanics, which as a population has a higher incidence of astigmatism and diabetes. We take a look at technology. People spend an enormous amount of time on their digital devices these days, resulting in eye strain and other issues. In addition, e-commerce continues to grow, albeit slowly in our profession, shifting from traditional brick and mortar locations. This is attractive as the cost of entry to create a national presence can be much lower. Telemedicine will continue to grow for better or worse, especially in optometry, which makes it easier and less expensive to provide access to care. We look at changing lifestyles. Consumers are still looking for convenience and real solutions. And I believe this is why e-commerce is still slow to grow in optometry. Our profession continues to innovate to meet lifestyle needs, such as transition contact lenses and other things. There's still a demand for high quality eye care, however, and patients are willing to pay for it. The value and affordability still matter, though, as a part of the total equation, which is where consolidation plays a role. And then looking at personal care, patients, especially millennials, are looking for experiences and connections. While they're more willing to buy online, and that's the world they grew up in, they still value experiences. Optometrists, maybe more than any other healthcare profession, has the ability to provide these experiences, whether it's someone's first pair of glasses or fitting someone contacts for their wedding day or finding that perfect pair of sunglasses. We continue to advance not only in optical products, but in diagnosis and management of disease. We just look at dry eye as an example. Our regulatory climate is still very favorable and continues to improve. California changing the branch office rule is a good example of that. And lastly, while not everyone's favorite topic, managed vision care continues to drive a large number of patients to see their optometrists. Another factor to consider is that optical retail in general is actually fairly well protected against the digital disruption. Let's look at some of the reasons why. And I know we hear all the doom and gloom about what's going on with Warby and 1-800 and all those things. But look at these things. So for health, people still want live attention when being fit with a medical device. And I think that's why Warby Parker is finding it needs to expand its brick and mortar locations. Also, with an aging population resulting in increase of ocular conditions, the need for a trusted local doctor continues to increase. As far as fashion is concerned, as much as the online retail continues to try to change it, eyewear is still a fashion statement that customers want to try on before committing. As for fit, technology really doesn't exist today to enable fitting all prescriptions, especially multifocals that require additional measurements other than PD. And in addition, it's estimated that 20% of eyewear require adjustments within the first 2 weeks of dispensing, which clearly can't be done online. Insurance, currently, although this may change or it has been changing, insurance does not cover online purchases to the same extent as it does for in-network providers, and about 70% of all purchases are driven by some form of plan. If we look at legal and regulatory, many states are moving to make online refractions, or really what I would call online vision tests that result in a prescription, illegal. Furthermore, organizations such as the AOA continue to recommend biannual exams, including refraction by licensed doctors. And then the technology, as I said, just doesn't exist for patients to have a comprehensive eye exam from the comfort of their homes. Even the teleoptometry companies such as 2020 Now and Digital Optometrics still require a patient to come to a brick and mortar location for that remote exam. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, the technology just doesn't exist for successfully fitting prescriptions such as multifocals. Now, all these things can change. Many of them will and be resolved, but the outlook for optometry is really, really good. Some other factors to consider. While the number of optometrists continue to rise annually, especially with the increasing number of schools, it's only predicted to rise by about 15% between now and 2025. In the same time period, the number of ophthalmologists is only expected to grow about 4%. This positions us very well to handle escalating needs of medical eye care services. And to be clear, I'm not commenting on whether or not we have a surplus of optometrists, only that from an investment standpoint, ODs are well positioned to handle more than they do already. The issue for independent practice is the expense of continuously updating their systems with their current patient base in light of challenges to revenue, such as reduced reimbursements. And here is what I believe a lot of the value of consolidation can be realized. And what we're starting to see, again, I apologize, it switched again, is that new practice models, including technology advances, are emerging to meet these challenges. So let's switch gears, though, to why optometry itself should look at private equity. So let's look at the market pressure. Vertical integration is a big one, right? And I'm sure you've heard of a little merger that completed in 2018. There were several threads on all the OD wires, ODs on Facebook, corporate optometry on Facebook, and many doctors expressed their concerns, and those are just the ones that I actively follow. In full disclosure, as it was mentioned, I was the senior clinical director at Luxottica until just before this deal was complete. And while there, I saw the opportunities that the merger would create for both Essilor and Luxottica. I didn't think there'd be significant disruption to private practices, since Essilor has done a fairly decent job of appearing to be pro-private practice, and they wouldn't want to disrupt that. But I've since learned through our dealings with Vision Source doctors that are looking to sell to private equity that the latest Vision Source contracts prohibit the owner from selling practices for 4 years. I have no inside information. I want to be clear about that. But as an outsider looking in, that sounds a lot like Essilor Luxottica is getting ready to start purchasing practices, which we know they are through Team Vision, and they're going to add to their growing practice portfolio. Online disruptors, I don't believe that Warby Parker, Alternative, 1-800, and others are ready to take a significant share from independents, but their technology will continue to prove. They may not be a huge factor today, but by the time they are, private equity will most likely move on to other industries. And then there's new players emerging. We've seen CVS enter into an agreement with a retina specialist. We know Walmart is expanding their care to having these Walmart healthcare centers. I don't think they're going to go away. There's a ton of money behind them. They're not big yet, but by the time they get big enough to take significant share, it may be too late. There's other outside business pressures as well, such as managed vision care. Reimbursements continue to remain stagnant, or in some cases decreasing. I've heard of plans paying less than $20 for an eye exam. As VSP and IMED in particular continue to control tens of millions of lives, I just don't see this changing anytime soon. Add increasing overheads such as staff costs and occupancy, and it makes it harder and harder to remain profitable. There are inside business pressures as well. The cost of instruments continues to increase as new technology emerges for the diagnosis and treatment of ocular conditions. It certainly doesn't help with reimbursements for tests such as OCTs are dropping. Instruments like LipiFlow with procedures that are completely out of pocket help, but it sure isn't cheap. And with the cost of entry for the patient being high, it becomes harder to achieve significant acquisition rates to be profitable. The numbers I've heard from various vendors, specifically Alcon, is the number of times a LipiFlow in general gets used in a month is 4 times. So even when doctors are investing in this technology, they're finding it harder and harder to use it. I don't think that's true of everyone, but we certainly have seen it. Lastly, let's take a look at exit strategy. It's another reason for optometry to look at private equity. Doctor-to-doctor sales can sometimes be very complicated. Plus, the amount most ODs are willing to pay for practice is usually much less than what private equity is willing to pay. On top of that, with the amount of debt most optometrists have, bank financing becomes a little bit more difficult, and many times the seller has to hold the note. Another big issue is that many of the optometrists graduating today are just not interested in owning a practice. I've heard of practices closing due to not being able to find a seller. I've also been involved with recruiting optometrists for the last 8 years, and I have seen firsthand that a large number of new graduates would rather be employed than considering owning a practice. And again, that's a broad statement, not meant to represent everyone, but we're just seeing this trend increase. Now let's switch gears a little bit and discuss the major players. And I think this is probably what most people are interested in hearing. So first, it's important to understand the strategic positioning of the large organizations in our industry. On this graph, we have the x-axis representing limited versus full scope optometry and the y-axis representing value versus premium pricing. Now, in the upper left quadrant, we have LensCrafters and VisionWorks. They tend to play in the more of the premium pricing world, although people don't seem to think that, with LensCrafters being much more premium than VisionWorks. The strategies at these locations are skewed towards limited scope optometry. Now, it's not to say that doctors only provide limited care there, but the company's desire would be for the doctors to focus solely on refractive care. And the lack of space and support from the company makes it much more difficult to practice full scope. Again, not saying you can't do it there. It's just not set up that way. In the lower left quadrant, we have companies like Walmart, Costco, iMart Express, etc. There are many more, but these are some of the biggest. Here, the strategy is just value pricing and limited scope optometry. It's not to say that no doctors at these locations will practice at a higher level, but it's not the strategy of the company. Now, in the upper right-hand quadrant, we have the major private equity players, which we'll be discussing. Eye Care Partners, Kepler, MyDoctor, AEG, now Total Vision, and VSP Ventures, or excuse me, Team Vision and VSP Ventures. The strategy here skews towards more premium pricing and more full scope optometry. The practices that are sought after are successful retail, but also have a successful medical business. Now, independent eye care practitioners, what we call IECPs, can really be placed in any quadrant on this graph. But in general, from my experience visiting practices throughout the country, independents tend to practice more full scope, but I've definitely seen my share of limited scope practices. Pricing strategies for independents is all over the map and tends to depend mainly on their patient population. Now, before I get into each of the four groups, let's talk about the different acquisition models that you're going to be presented with. First, each model results in the seller becoming an employee. And I think that's important to note. You will become an employee in these situations. By definition, when you sell your practice, you are no longer the owner. You may still be responsible for the employees that work at the practice, but you will be employed by the company that buys you and have to report to a manager. If you don't think you can handle this, then selling to private equity is certainly not for you unless you're looking to completely retire. After becoming an employee, there are three common variations on the acquisition model. The first is to transform acquired practices into a national brand. This means your practice name will absolutely change. There will most likely be a remodel to match brand standards. All of your systems will be integrated into a common platform like EHR and your point of sale. And most, if not all, processes will be centralized, such as billing, recall, purchasing frames, etc. The next is to build a large regional brands. In this case, the group will usually start off with the acquisition of a multi-location practice and build on the brand in that region. Smaller practices may be purchased and tucked into the larger brands, either by renaming or incorporating the regional brand name. Think Dr. Smith Eye Care powered by a big brand. In this model, there's usually an integration process of common platforms and centralized processes. The third model is very simple. The practice is typically left intact with some centralized processes, but no real integration of systems into a common platform. You can think of these three as a continuum, with the first being a complete transformation of your practice to a new brand, and the third being on the complete other side of the spectrum where nothing really changes after the sale. The second model, of course, is a hybrid of both. So what about the pros and cons of each of these? All right, so let's talk about transforming every acquisition into a national brand. Here are the pros. You relinquish all management responsibilities, although some of you may think that that's a con. Typically, you'll report to a district manager, and there will be a whole field organization who will be responsible for the management of your office. There's a national brand recognition. Think LensCrafters and how much name recognition there is with that brand. This also allows for national marketing campaigns. With every location usually running the same promotions, it's also easier and much more cost-effective to advertise on a national level. Reduced overhead. So you can, by centralizing functions like payroll, HR, billing, you can reduce headcount. On top of that, when you're able to not only centralize purchasing, but in the case of contact lenses, for example, dictate behavior, vendors are much more likely to offer better pricing. We're seeing an interesting phenomenon now. As large practices are being purchased by private equity groups, the vendors are concerned about losing large customers. So they are willing to negotiate deals that in the past may have only been reserved for large buying groups. By integrating data across multiple locations, the operations team has access to a ton of information. And this creates opportunities to learn best practices, execute new ideas, and spread those across multiple locations much quicker. There are cons of this model, though. There's a complete loss of individual brand identity, and this becomes very apparent to patients. If you don't think that can happen to you, just look at big names like Ossip and Schaefer that were both converted to My Eye Doctor, which has now officially happened from what I've been told. These locations have a very commercial feel in general, as offices get remodeled to match natural sand branders. And all locations will start to look very similar, which is what they want, just like lens crafters. So if we look at creating regional brands, here the idea is to start with a large, well-known local brand and grow it within a region through additional acquisitions. Now, the pros for this model are similar to the last one. You will no longer be responsible for day-to-day management of the practice. And as with the other model, there will be a whole team dedicated to running your practice. In this model, the local brand stays intact, so patients shouldn't really see much of a difference. As with the other model, overhead can be reduced, both by centralizing functions and by increased negotiating power with vendors. Here again, integrating systems creates a lot of opportunities for better management. And these practices, unlike the previous model, maintain a private practice feel. There's a remodel done. It's to modernize the office rather than make it look like the rest. But the cons of this model is there's no national brand recognition. Local brands may not compete as effectively as national ones. Part of that is due to the fact that regional marketing is required, and this can be very expensive and is less effective than national campaigns. All right, so what about the last one where nothing is done? So in this model, the practice is purchased with the intent of changing very little in how it is run. The pros on this model, though, once again, management responsibilities can be eliminated, although in some cases they're not. In this case, though, a local manager needs to run the practice, and oftentimes that will be the selling doctor. The local brand remains intact, so patients do not notice any difference post-close, hopefully. Overhead can be reduced, although not a lot of processes are centralized. Some may be where appropriate, such as billing, but there's also increased leverage. There's also increased leverage with vendors, but not to the same extent as the other two. This is due to the fact that there's no centralized control of what is prescribed, so there's less upside to the vendors. This model, like the last one, remain a private practice feels nothing is usually done to the practice post-close. There's also cons, though: a lack of national, even regional brand recognition, unless the practice already had multiple locations. Each brand requires specific marketing, as every practice in the fleet is still individual. This even eliminates the ability to market regionally in some cases. And lastly, when there's basically no systems integration, it's difficult to affect positive changes in each practice. All right, so let's dig into the actual players. So My Eye Doctor is absolutely the biggest. Sue Downs is their CEO. They've been actively expanding in several markets. I'll show you the map here in a second. Their current location is not 772. They're actually over 800, I think. And this changes every time I write this lecture, so I have to be careful. But this is when the lecture was approved. So I believe they're over 800 offices now. They operate under one consumer brand, which is My Eye Doctor, and they're currently backed by investment firm Goldman Sachs. Now we take a look at what their geographic market looked like in 2019, just so you can see growth. Now these blue states represent, or blue colors represent states with 5 or more locations, and this was in 2019. You take a look at 2022 and you can see massive expansion, right? And you can see where they tend to live in the East and the South. They're starting to venture west. Colorado, you'll see, seems to be a very, very popular state for private equity. But you can see how much growth that they've had and where they've kind of avoided. And now they're running into some problems in that they can't expand in some states because of their market share and their relationship with VSP, which we can talk about at a different time during the panel, I guess. If we look at their core values, this simply comes right from their website. So their passion and commitment is to patient-focused vision service has allowed them to extend premier eye care services to patients of all ages at their optometry offices. Their business model is all acquisitions are transformed into a national brand, and they integrate all systems. And equity opportunity, I'm actually not as familiar with this, and so that's a good question for the panel. I don't know what's currently being offered as an equity opportunity for when you sell, if you're allowed to reinvest. I'm assuming there is. I'm just not familiar with it. We look at eye care partners. David Clark is their CEO now. He took over for Kelly McGran about a year ago. Their current location count is over 500 offices. Now they operate under several regional brands like Clarkson Eye Care. That's their biggest. Toma and Sutton, Eye Care Centers, Eye Care Associates. There's a bunch of others. And currently they're backed by Partners Group as of 2019. I don't think that has changed. If you look at where their geographic market was, and again, these represent states with 5 or more locations, they tended to be more in the East and in the South, but you can see they've had some expansion as well as they've continued to grow and where they stand right now at 2022. Now, their core values, they're a mission-driven company that aims to set the highest standards of excellence, integrating the best patient care practices and business operations systems, processes to optimize each practice within our growing roster of member practices. And their business model is they want to build large, recognized regional brands and potentially rebrand smaller acquisitions, integrate all systems into a common platform and centralized processes. And their equity opportunity, the last we heard, was opportunity for matured equity. And again, that's a good question for the panel. What I will say about Eye Care Partners is they've taken a much more integrated healthcare approach, and you're going to see MD and OD practices combined. They're focusing a lot more on MD practices right now. So they have a lot of ophthalmology. And quite honestly, it's a very nice model where you have the ability to keep patients that you're referring for advanced treatment or surgical care within your network, which I happen to think is kind of the future of optometry. Next is Kepler. Nicholas Williams is currently the CEO, and they're over, I think, 300 offices now. They were launched since 2017 to seek partnerships with ODs and to assist in managing medically focused optometry practices in the US. And this is one that was formed by people you'll know. Ben Gaddy was involved with this, as was Paul Karpecki and Jay Binkowitz. The network currently includes Gaddy, Shady Grove, which is, I believe, Alan Glazier, Gailmard, which is Neil Gailmard, Omni, Bladen. So they have a lot of big names in our profession, and they're based by Toronto. They're backed, by a Toronto-based Imperial Capital. And really in 2019, they only had one state where they had more than 4 locations. And I believe that was Dr. Gaddy's office. However, they have since expanded quite a bit. And really, they're the only group that's extensive on the West Coast, specifically in California, Oregon, and Washington, and even Nevada, to my knowledge. And now you can see they're in Idaho as well. So you can see quite a bit of expansion since 2022. Now, their core value is they're a rapidly growing group of optometry practices with the goal of having a nationwide presence of medically oriented, industry-leading optometry practices dedicated to serving the vision care needs of patients with the highest quality of care and products available. And you can see the theme here. They certainly are trying to take a very, very private practice approach. They are going to leave the practice brand intact and have the ability to have centralized processes, but it's not required. And there is really no integration of systems into a common platform initially. You can choose to do that. And quite honestly, their model is struggling a little bit with trying to get sold. And so now they're starting to get more and more aggressive with requiring people to be involved in their centralized processes. And their equity, they do allow people to buy in. AEG, Eric Anderson is the CEO. We're actually at 282 locations now. We operate under a portfolio of local brands, including Crown Vision Centers, iTeek, International Eye Care Center, 1 Hour Optical. We actually have, I think now 60 or 70 different brands. We're backed by Riata Capital Group, which is a former lead group in Vision Source. These guys, 2 of the founders of Riata were part of the equity group that bought Vision Source from TLC and the Vision Source group, and then eventually sold them to Essilor. And you can see 2019, the states that AEG Vision was in, and then again now in 2022. And AEG tends to take a little bit more conservative approach and tends to go deeper rather than wider, and quite honestly tries to avoid some of the other private equity groups so there's less competition where we purchase. AEG's core values were a caring community of local eye care providers that improves the health of our neighbors, helping them see better and look their best one patient at a time. We deliver a remarkable experience to our patients, customers, and teams. Our unique brand family leverages the strengths and capabilities of the Acuity Common platform, but still maintains the local identity that makes each brand special, and we are truly better together. The business model for AEG is to build large, recognized regional brands, potentially rebrand smaller acquisitions, and integrate all systems into a common platform and centralize the processes. And the equity opportunity is for founders' equity, is what we call it. And again, that's a good conversation for the panel. So shifting gears now, let's see if private equity is right for you. So in order to answer these questions, I believe there are 3 main categories. And these may not be the only ones, but I feel that they're important. They're the most important in deciding if selling to a private equity group is right for you. And they're simply financial, professional, and personal. If we look at financial, the obvious one here is purchase price. In a few minutes, I'll discuss how practices are valued, but from a 50,000 foot level, this is a fundamental question. How much do you think your practice is worth? We hear a lot today about multiples, but at the end of the day, the amount of money you will walk away with is far more important than what multiple you were paid. It's impossible to consider that what your practice may be worth 2, 5, or even 10 years from now, knowing that the buying landscape or buyer landscape is going to be different than it is today. The next thing to consider is what your salary will become as an employee of the practice. Of course, this only matters if you're currently an active provider in the practice, and if you plan to continue in that role after you sell. Many sellers are not actively practicing. Here's where I tend to see a lot of misunderstanding of how private equity looks at optometric practices. We'll get into a lot of this in a bit, but the bottom line is your total salary needs to be separated into what the business pays you as the optometrist seeing patients versus what you receive as a business owner. Since you will no longer be the owner, that part of your annual income goes away. Well, actually, you're paid a lump sum of that when you sell for the practice, but so you'll be able to. So will you be able to work in what was once your practice, being paid as an employed doctor? One thing I did not mention before is that some of the purchase agreements require the seller to stay on as an employee for a certain period of time. This also is something to ask about while going through the process if you think you may want to simply retire after the sale. And then another financial consideration is your investment opportunity. As I mentioned previously in reviewing the private equity firms, your investment opportunity can vary. Some buyers require you to invest a percentage of your proceeds back into the private equity group. For others, it may not be an option. For those where you can invest, it's important to know at what level you're investing. Are you getting on floor 1 or 2, or are you investing at floor 4 and they're planning to sell floor 5, meaning your return may be significantly less than other investment opportunities. So let's take a look at the professional considerations. The first is the impact on your practice's culture. Presumably, one of the reasons you're being courted by private equity is because of your success. In my experience, a big part of the practice success is due to the culture created by the owner and his or her staff. Will that change once the practice is sold? What will happen if the practice is completely rebranded? What if you no longer carry independent frame lines, or your contact lens manufacturer of choice doesn't have a good relationship with the new owner? In most deals I've seen where money is held back for a period of time and paid out based on post-close milestones, will the new ownership have a negative effect on your business so you're not able to meet those milestones? Related to the practice culture is staff. In many sales, people are let go as synergies are created. How will your staff react to that? Will they continue to enjoy working for the practice if you're no longer calling shots? How will your associate ODs handle the change? They may change, they will in most cases change from reporting to you to reporting to a non-optometrist in some cases, or just to another optometrist that's not in the practice. Will this affect their production and potentially your total payout? Maybe staff and culture doesn't matter as long as you get your money. That's up to you. But for most owners that are actively involved in the practice, I would find that very unlikely. What about patient care? When selling to another private OD, you usually have a good feel for their approach to patient care, or at least feel comfortable that you can help them understand your approach and how that has enabled you to be successful. When you sell to private equity group, there may be patient care protocols that you may or may not agree with. How would you handle that? The upside is that becoming part of a large organization should create opportunities to elevate patient care, but this is definitely something you need to understand before you decide which group you ultimately associate with. Another consideration is the burden of business management post-close. How much do you want to be involved in running the business once you sell? Once you determine your comfort level, does that match the expectation of the buyer? Maybe you want to get completely out of the lane and take a role in the large organization. Will they allow that? I know of several sellers that have gone on to take roles in corporate development or operations in the private equity group that purchased their practice. And what about the level of investment in your practice and or people post-close? Will the new organization install new instruments? Will they provide better benefits to employees or invest in training? Does that matter to you? These are all things to discuss before you sell, so there are no surprises. And then lastly, we have the personal. These are considerations that really only you can answer. So how many years do you expect to continue practicing? I can tell you from observing several deals, it's been, over 150 now. If you're not thinking about retirement within the next 3 to 5 years, these deals are not that good for you. We'll discuss this more as we look at valuations. How will you handle losing operational control? You may not put a lot of thought into it now, but you will lose the ability to simply implement a new policy or purchase something as simple as a printer. Many optometrists, me included, wanted to own a practice to have complete control how things were run. Once you sell your practice, you will most likely lose that control. Similar to that, and to the financial consideration of being paid as an employee, how will you handle being an employee, especially when you may answer to a non-optometrist? In a former life, I would hear complaints all the time from the employed ODs about reporting to a store manager or a district manager that wasn't an OD. That's the nature of corporate optometry. Well, the truth is that practices under private equity groups are similar to corporate optometry, especially in how they're structured operationally. Are you ready for that? What about your legacy? Depending on who you sell to, your practice name might completely go away. Your practice may have been part of that community for the past 30 years, but if you choose to sell to a national brand, that's going to change. We have great examples of that with Dr. Ossip and Dr. Schaefer. Does maintaining the legacy of your practice you built in the community matter to you? And finally, can you trust your new partners? This one is probably the most difficult one to answer, but possibly the most important. Even if you choose to retire immediately after the sale, in most cases, you will still be in the business with them until your final payout. Can you trust them to do right by you, your practice, your staff, and your patients? My recommendation would be to talk to other practices that have sold to the group you're talking to. The first indication, I apologize, let me finish this thought. Your first indication of whether or not you can trust them is if they have any concerns with you reaching out to people that have bought from them or that they have bought from in the past. So probably one of the most important things you guys want to know is, how is your practice going to be valued? So let's look at a traditional OD to OD sale. Valuations for these types of sales have been and continue to be calculated several different ways. When I bought my practice, Al Kleiman, who many of you know, was the broker. And he'd like to say, when you've seen one deal, you've seen one deal. And this continues to hold true, even though the first time I heard him say that was, my God, 22 years ago now. Here's the quick and dirty. There is a quick and dirty method to calculate a practice value, although even the way even the way they do this continues to evolve. And I've heard anything is from what you see on the screen here. I've heard average of past 3 years annual gross, average of past 3 years annual net, average of the past 3 years net times 3 to 66% of an average of the past 3 years annual growth. The list goes on and on. I don't know if any way is more correct than the next. I tend to think in terms of cash flow. When you do that, other factors come into play, such as cost of financing, which will have nothing to do with how successful the practice is, but really matters to the new owner if they can't afford to make their loan payments. Now, a newer approach, and you heard Eric mention it, has something to do with EBITDA. And according to the conversation I had with Gary Gerber a while back, we're starting to see OD to OD sales valued at about 2 to 3 times EBITDA. And this is really where we get the term multiples from. And in my opinion, is the direct result of all purchases by private equity. So what is EBITDA? It stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. To be honest, I had no idea what this was when I owned a practice. It wasn't until I worked for B&L that I became familiar with the term, as our bonuses were often tied to the EBITDA of the business. EBITDA is a measure of the company's financial performance. It's basically net income. However, it excludes expenses associated with debt. For OD to private equity sales, there are some differences. The main one being that in most cases, the owner is also an employee of the business that generates a significant percentage of the revenue. To account for that, most PE firms use an adjusted EBITDA. From that adjusted EBITDA, they will pay a multiple. This could be anywhere from 5 times to over 10 times. However, I've seen even lower than that. I've seen even higher than that. And the reason for a large range is that a multiple is dependent on several factors: number of locations. In many instances, there are less potential upside when purchasing one location versus 15. Plus, if this is the first purchase in an area, starting with a larger presence is worth more than going in and trying to grow one practice at a time. Has EBITDA been increasing or decreasing over the last few years? Obviously, we want to see it increasing. While not completely predictive, it does give a sense of the overall health of the business and what can be expected. The potential access to additional deals in the area. If the first seller is influential in the community and likely to help convince other practices to sell it, then it could make sense to pay the first seller more and then net down the multiple with additional purchases. How much additional investment is going to be required post-close? The equipment, fixtures, carpeting, et cetera from the 80s. Capital will be required to update the practice, and this will require an adjustment to the purchase price, which directly affects the multiple. So let's take a minute to discuss how EBITDA can be adjusted. EBITDA will get adjusted for a number of reasons. The biggest adjustment, as I said earlier, usually comes from the owner also being an employee who produces a significant percentage of the revenue. So if you rarely see patients, this probably won't have much effect on you. For those business owners that also actively see patients when selling to a private equity firm, the amount you earn as an optometrist must be separated from the amount you make as a business owner. This is different than when you sell to another optometrist that plans on seeing patients just as you do. Now, it sounds like a simple concept, but I got to tell you, for some reason, it is a very common source of confusion for sellers. So let's look at it a little bit more closely. When the private equity firm purchases your practice, they are only buying the revenue from owning the practice. Things like the seller's salary and benefits, while once were income to the owner, are now expenses and must therefore be subtracted from EBITDA. And while some owners try to manage tax implications by shifting money from salary to dividends, for example, there is still an OD salary that must be paid to maintain revenue. So it doesn't matter how income is classified for IRS purposes, there will be an adjustment to account for paying the employee as an optometrist. Paying the employed optometrist. So let's take a look at an example. Take a practice with 1 million gross. We hear the magic number of 30% net for successful practices, so I'll use that, but I will tell you that number is artificially inflated. So at the end of the day, the practice has 300,000 left over after paying all of its expenses. Well, sort of. The owner sees patients every day, and for that pays herself a salary of 150,000. That leaves 150,000 left over for the practice after paying all of its true expenses, which includes employees. And the doctor in this case is an employee. And that is the actual EBITDA, 150,000. Doesn't matter the owner optometrist makes 300, because in order for the private equity firm to realize 1 million in revenue, they're going to have to pay someone 150 in salary. Now, it's not all skewed in private equity's favor. There's something called add backs that increases EBITDA. Expenses such as leasing a car or other expenses, personal or otherwise, that would not persist after the sale can be added back into the EBITDA calculations, resulting in a higher value. But at the end of the day, as I mentioned earlier, EBITDA and multiples are not the most important thing. What is important is the final agreed upon sale price. Things like adjusted EBITDA and add backs can be calculated differently by each private equity firm. And if you're only focused on the multiple, you'll get caught. If the adjusted EBITDA calculation is lower, you may get a higher multiple and less overall money. My advice is to focus on the actual dollars that will hit your bank account. There is no competition for who gets the higher multiple. Not that there's a competition for who gets the most money, but we know how optometrists are. But when you look back at your transaction, remember a higher multiple is an arbitrary number while money in your bank is real. So why don't we take a look at a few examples? So let's look at two potential transactions for the same practice. The first will be OD to OD and the second will be OD to PE. Practice grosses $1 million. In the OD to OD sale, we would look at the total owner compensation, which includes what is earned and as the optometrist in the practice. In the OD to PE sale, we would separate out what is earned as an employee and what the business makes. For the OD to OD sale, knowing that typically we are seeing 2 to 3 times EBITDA, we use 2.5 times just to get the value for the purpose of this example of $750,000. For the OD to PE sale, we will go to the low end and make things fair and use 6 times multiple, resulting in a value of $900,000. Seems like private equity sale makes sense here, assuming all of the considerations made sense and the only concern was money. But it's never that easy, is it? There are other considerations. So using the practice example from the previous slide, let's add some scenarios. In scenario number 1, let's say the OD sells for $900,000. Sorry, it skipped ahead. For $900,000 and works for a practice for an additional 10 years before retiring. Furthermore, let's assume the seller agrees to a salary of $125,000. In this salary, over the next 10 years, assuming no raises, the seller would have made $2.15 million. This does not include any additional upside from reinvesting some of the proceeds, which you have to think about. But what if the seller says, you know what, nah, I'm not going to sell just yet. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing and sell when I'm ready to retire. So in scenario 2, the owner continues to take home $300,000 per year, assuming the practice does not continue to grow at all. Then in 10 years, the owner sells to another OD, as PE most likely has moved on from optometry at that 2.5 times EBITDA. This yields a total compensation of $3.75 million over the same time period as scenario 1. Now, of course, that requires you to work for 10 years, which a lot of these sellers do not want to do. What about the third scenario? What if the owner decides to retire, but instead of selling, they hire an associate? And so in scenario 3, the owner pays this new associate $100,000 per year in the next 10 years. At the end of that time, the owner sells that associate and gets their 2.5 times EBITDA. In this scenario, the total compensation over 10 years is 2.75. Now, of course, all these examples make a lot of assumptions. In scenario 1, most likely the seller would negotiate a higher salary than $125,000, or there would at least be bonuses or both, plus you would expect annual raises. In scenario 2, I assume the practice didn't grow and therefore any increase in the value over 10 years was not included. Of course, what can happen in these scenarios is the owner slows down a bit or passes patients to a newer associate and the revenue decreases, so it can go both ways. And in scenario 3, I also assume the practice didn't grow, and in this case, it's probably more likely it will see a decrease, at least in the first couple of years. In both scenario 2 and 3, I assume there would be a buyer for the practice in 10 years, which we have seen today may not be the case. Now, all that being said, though, from a strictly financial perspective, I firmly believe that if you are 10 or more years away from retiring, you're probably better off holding off on and not selling your practice. I feel that if you're looking to retire in the next 1 to 3 years, this is really a no-brainer. Again, strictly from a financial perspective, you'll make more money by selling private equity than selling to another OD. Of course, this decision is not only about the financial considerations, as I mentioned earlier, still the professional and the personal considerations to think about. So that being said, for those 1 to 3 years away from retirement and those 10 or more years away from retirement, the financial considerations will play either a significant or insignificant role, respectively. For those 3 to 10 years away from retirement, well, the picture gets a little more cloudy, and each of the 3 main considerations probably play an equal role. Now, there's one more wrinkle to these scenarios. If you do have the opportunity to reinvest a portion of your sale proceeds into the private equity firm, and depending on what floor you get in on, you can make additional money when the private equity firm sells, which essentially allows you to sell a portion of your practice again. Again, depending on the value of your investment, you can make an additional 4 times return. So in the example we use, if the seller invested 10% of their proceeds or $90,000, they could realize another $270,000 in profit. All this to say is this decision is not something to be taken lightly, and there's a lot more to consider than just how much money someone is willing to throw at you. Here's some other valuation considerations. For the most part, the first acquisition in a region will usually be a large practice with EBITDA of 3 million or more. Not always the case, but that's what usually happens. This applies mainly to the larger private equity firms that are actually consolidating practice, which, if I'm being honest, is where the real investment opportunities are. The fact that there aren't that many practices in the US that meet that criteria, so most acquisitions will be those tuck-ins that will be added to an already developed network in the region. This means the average optometric practice owner is less likely to see 10 times multiples, although they are still likely to realize a higher valuation from private equity than individual buyers. Now, in addition, some practices are just not going to be big enough to be on the radar of private equity. This will be dependent on the market as well as how big of a presence the private equity firm already has in the region. For example, a smaller practice that helps increase saturation in a market is more value than a small outlier, as there is more upside to the overall network to increase brand presence. One way to mitigate this is to begin to self-consolidate and build a network of optometric practices under one umbrella. Of course, if that were easy to do, maybe we wouldn't see so much activity by private equity, to be honest with you. And I can tell you some people on the panel have a lot of experience with bringing together a bunch of individual practices into a consolidated practice to sell to private equity that don't actually ever truly consolidate financially. They just negotiate together. Now, what can you expect if you sell your practice to private equity? Well, before anything begins, you usually have to sign a letter of intent, or what we call an LOI. This is a document that basically says both parties intend to close the deal. Once the LOI is signed, the diligence period will begin. Now, this is not a final commitment that you can't get out of. It's a letter of intent. During the diligence period, you can expect that the buyer will have an exclusivity period anywhere between 60 to 120 days, meaning the seller cannot talk to another buyer during this period. And the reason for this is the buyer is about to invest a significant amount of money on diligence, which will include several different work streams. The last thing they want is to spend a lot of time and money only to find out the seller has been working with 2 other potential buyers, or even worse, get involved in a bidding situation. In addition to the exclusivity agreement, there will also be a mutual NDA in place, and this is done to protect both the buyer and the seller. So what are these work streams that we're looking at? Well, the buyer, along with a range of third-party service providers, will work through the following work streams. Financial assessment, known as the quality of earnings. This will assess how a company accumulates its revenues, such as cash or non-cash, recurring or non-recurring. Put simply, if a practice reports a positive net income, but poor quality earnings, then acquiring the company may be a more risky investment than the company's financial statements indicate. Medical billing practices assessment. Here, they're looking to see if there are opportunities to improve billing practice, or maybe even bring in new services, as well as whether there are audit risks from questionable billing behaviors. Synergy assessment. This is done to determine bottom line upside after the practice is acquired. For example, does this practice have a big billing department that can be centralized, or does it own a lab that can take additional work from other locations that is currently being farmed out? Provider assessment. The employment agreements for each optometrist will be reviewed. It is important to understand if salaries and benefits might change in a way that could result in providers leaving. Reimbursement assessment. The buyer will want to understand if the practices are being reimbursed at the appropriate level, specifically to see if there are any opportunities for upside here. And then there's the market competitive assessment. Here, the buyer wants to understand the competitive landscape. How many practices are in the same town? Who are they, et cetera? Is there a new mall coming with a lens crafters, or is a Target remodeling with an optical? Things like that. And then a real estate assessment. The buyer will want to review all leases. While rent, expiration date, renewal terms are very important, the buyer also needs to know if the landlords are willing to transfer the lease to the new owner. And in my experience, most private equity groups are not in the real estate business. So if you own your real estate, you will, I think in almost all cases, be able to continue to own your real estate and lease that back to the practice. So you can see there's a lot of information about your practice that's going to be required. And as the size of the practice increases, so does the complexity. So in my experience, most optometrists are not prepared for this. And what makes it worse is most don't have the time or resources to gather all the information that are required to complete a transaction. So as you can imagine, there are people that can help, and these are the brokers. Several practice brokers are now specializing in private equity deals, and you're going to meet a few of them on the call today. Brokers can be very helpful to the seller during the process. And to be fair, they're helping buyers identify potential acquisitions, as well as packaging all the required documents to make the process easier. So the brokers are really benefiting both sides. They're certainly there to represent the seller, but they are the ones in many cases that are bringing the sellers to the buyer. So before you make a decision to engage in a broker, though, there are some things to consider. There's a fee that comes from your proceeds. Think of this like a real estate agent where the fees come from the sale of the house. If you already have the necessary information or have the means to obtain it easily, you may not need a broker. Their pitch to you, though, is going to be they can get you a higher price, and they will try to create a bidding war between different private equity firms. And in fact, they've done that. And in many times, they've gotten higher selling prices for their clients. In my opinion, you need to consider a couple of things. Number one, will the increase in sale price they get you cover their fee? If not, then you've lost money. Number two, just because you get a higher offer from one of the private equity firms because of the actions of the broker, it may not be the firm that you want to sell to based on their model and all the other considerations we discussed. You're still going to have to pay the fee if you go with a lower offer that more aligns to your overall needs. And number three, if buyers don't like dealing with the buyers don't like dealing with brokers in general, if they do not have to for many reasons, they would prefer that. You may want to sell to a particular private equity group that may not even choose to bid on your practice. Your contract with a broker may still require you to pay their fee for a period of time, even if you don't use the service for their sale. Now, I'm a fan of the brokers, especially the ones that are on this call. We work closely with them. So you guys have to make that decision for yourself. Once the sale closes, though, it's time for the integration process. And each private equity firm is going to have their own timeline depending on what their model is. Some will even begin some of the integration before a close or in connection with one. Some may leave things alone for a period of time as they assess the needs of the newly acquired practice. So it's really hard to tell you exactly when the integration process will take place because it can vary from each private equity firm. We can review what the work streams are going to be. So they're going to consist of basically the following: accounting and finance. Most of the time, these will be centralized, so a lot of the work will go into moving these functions offsite. Billing and managed vision care, what we call MVC. Same thing applies here. This may require a bit more work with integrating point of sale systems in EHR, but in general, a lot of private equity firms are centralizing these functions. HR and payroll agreements will be signed prior to close, but payrolls usually move so that everyone is on the same system. Staffing and support, there may be a lot of changes here, especially as synergies are realized. And there will usually be a whole team working on this. Equipment, lab, and merchandise. While some of this may stay local, like a finishing lab, for example, it will usually be managed centrally as will things like frame purchasing to take advantage of scale. That all is going to change. Marketing, the buyer will need to understand all the current marketing and determine how best to incorporate that into the larger plan. IT systems, this is a huge undertaking, but it's one of the areas behind the scenes that will pay real dividends. Most consolidators will want all locations on the same POS and electronic health records. So to summarize what I can regarding the timeline for pre and post close process, the timeline can vary widely and not just among the different private equity firms. It can actually vary within the same firm because much of the variability is due to the seller. The more prepared you are and the quicker you respond to requests, the shorter the process will be. In general, however, you should prepare for a 60 to 120 day diligence period. The post-close integration will also vary, but this is more dependent on the buyer's business model. The general rule of thumb is the sooner it occurs, the better. There will be a lot of uncertainty for the associates, and the larger the practice, the more concerns there usually are. The quicker things can get to a place of normalcy, even if it's different than what was before, the better it is for everyone involved. So now some final thoughts. Private equity acquisitions are only going to increase over the next couple of years. There have been big acquisitions that you've seen. We've now seen Team Vision with EssilorLuxottica get involved. We've now seen VSP Ventures. There's a group in California. I always forget the name of that. It's based out of San Diego. And we're seeing more and more. We're starting to see ophthalmology private equity groups, of which there's like 27 of them, last I heard, starting to get a little bit more involved in optometry. So it's not going away. Now, that being said, the influx of money is not going to last forever. I think what you'll see is most of the large practices eventually sell because, let's be honest, who else can buy them? But we'll also see smaller successful practices sell as those owners see opportunity. And I mean to private equity when I say this, but once most of the better practices are sold, the next phase will be the consolidation of the private equity firm. And what I mean by that is someone's going to put together a fund to buy 2 or 3 of the consolidators to create an even larger network. With the changing demographics within optometry, I think OD to OD sales are going to get more challenging, and this will only get worse through the point in time when private equity will no longer be an option. With rising student debt, a generation of ODs that have much different priorities than previous generations, we are already seeing changes. It's not good or bad. It just is what it is. There are already countless threads with optometrists complaining of not being able to find someone to buy their practice. And I know there's countless threads about buyers, doctors who want to buy that can't buy. I get that. But there's stories of practices just closing. Before making a decision on whether or not to take advantage of this current market, you need to have a clear understanding of your career timeframe and goals. If you were 10 or more years out from retiring, unless you really hate owning a practice, and you're going to sell anyway, I don't think it makes a lot of sense for you. Now, that's not to say we have not purchased practices where the sellers have remained for 10 years or more, or plan to remain for 10 years or more. In essence, you cannot rely on the financial gain to overcome the professional and personal considerations in this situation. Meaning, if the reason you want to do this is just for the financial windfall, you'd be better off waiting until you're ready to retire. You'll make more money in the long run. On the other hand, if you're thinking of retiring in 2 to 3 years, I believe the financial gain will more than overcome any professional and personal considerations. Where it gets trickiest for those of you that are 4 to 9 years out. For you, financial, professional, and personal considerations are probably about equal, so you must think through them all and come to the right decision for you. There's one other piece to consider I haven't really talked about is when you get this lump sum of money, you can invest that in other things, whether it be real estate or other businesses that can also generate revenue for you. So you also have to consider that as well. We get a lot of sellers that are telling us that they're making a ton of money in their practice, but they've maxed out and they believe they can, if they can invest in other businesses, they actually can make more money. And so they sell earlier than they probably would have and maximize their investment. Finally, if you make this decision to sell to a private equity firm, make sure you research the differences between them and choose the partner that most closely matches your needs and wants. And remember, sometimes that may not be the firm that offers you the most money. And with that, we can go to question and answer. I haven't been really looking at the thread, so I'm going to take a look at that. But I appreciate you taking the time to listen. I hope I gave you some new insight on private equity and whether or not it makes sense for you either today or sometime in the future.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, I'm wondering, let's actually push the Q&A to our roundtable panel. There's some great questions that I think we can get a lot of good answers from.
You bet.
And while we're assembling the roundtable, I'm going to pass the torch over to Wade. We've got a brief intermission here, and Wade is going to share a little bit about his company, 4 Eyes Bookkeeping. So Wade, if you want to take the floor, and I will assemble all the panelists while you're doing that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Aaron. Intermission. I feel like that little intermission comic that they used to have at the drive-in movies way back in the 70s, where they used to show this little comic strip where it said, let's all go to the lobby. So I can hear everybody leaving right now as I do my presentation. But for those of you who are staying in here, basically, if you don't know who I am, I'm Wade Wise, owner of 4 Eyes Bookkeeping. I am an optometrist with over 25 years of experience in seeing, frontline duties as an optometrist. And not only am I very interested in today's webinar from a previous practice owner, the change of the landscape now that PE has kind of presented to us that really wasn't around when I kind of left private practice a couple of years ago. This is extremely interesting to me from a professional standpoint as an optometrist. But now as a bookkeeper, and we do, optometrists bookkeeping for them. And as an ancillary or an adjunct service now, we've found ourselves starting to do some PE valuations, or not do the actual PE valuations, but providing the financials to lend to the PE valuations. So when I was asked to do this, I was like, okay, this is a hot button. I'm very interested. I do have a little bit of experience in it, and maybe I have, a couple 2 cents worth to kind of add to the discussion here. So I was very interested in listening to Ben, and this is the first time I've heard Ben, and man, oh man, I wanted to jump in with a lot of interjections along the way, but obviously I couldn't do that. But in addition to a lot of great things that he said, one of the things that I kind of want to hit on is his brief mention of a lot of assumptions. Okay. And I think that's where bookkeeping comes in that we eliminate a lot of the assumptions when it comes to the financials of the practice. He mentioned add backs and, if you have a car on here and things like that. Well, once you start cleaning up a set of books, you're going to get those add backs in. You're going to have less assumptions. PE is going to have less assumptions. And overall, and I've made mention to this over on the ODsonFinance website, that even though you may end up increasing your value to that EBITDA figure, I think all parties would be very, very happy to know that even if the valuation is higher and even if PE is paying a little bit more, that everybody's more happy with the numbers and more confident in the numbers and frankly, more trusting of the numbers, and that the doctor is getting maybe a little bit more money because of the increased EBITDA, but PE really knows what they are buying. They are more confident in all aspects, and it's really a true win-win situation. I mentioned that the other day, didn't get any feedback on it. Maybe some of the panelists and the presenters here can kind of hit me if I'm off a little bit about that. But just in a general real sense, I think there's a lot of value in knowing what you're buying or what you're selling, and that's all dependent on financial data. So what we've done here is we've provided the accuracy, the up-to-dateness, the concentration to the details that I think is essential in order to provide the most accurate numbers for all parties involved. Now, EBITDA has been hit really, really hard. Everybody wants to know EBITDA. Everybody wants an accurate EBITDA, but EBITDA, if you don't know, the formula for EBITDA is very, very simple. It's net profit plus interest, plus taxes, plus depreciation, and plus amortization. It's a real simple formula and anybody can do math, right? But the very, very basics and the basis of EBITDA is net. To get to net is the hard part. EBITDA is easy once you have the net, but the net is the hard part because you have your revenue, you have your expenses, you have your distributions, you have your depreciations. And in order for the average DIYer to do all this work just to get to net, well, we all know what our QuickBooks looks like, what those financials look like, and just to get to net is a hard enough task. Now we want to attach EBITDA, to which PE is most interested, and then you can add those multipliers on top of that. And I don't want to be too long here, but I will give you a little example of what we went through just recently, I guess. I do have a little bit of experience in preparing the financials for private practices who are being courted by PE. And I want to bring up one instance in particular. A very large practice who's basically looking at an 8-figure PE buyout. Not 6, not 7, not 8, but it's 8. So what we did for that practice was we went in, cleaned up the books of the practice over the last 3 to 5 year period. And what ended up happening is when we did all those add backs that Ben was talking about, and we produced financials that were accurate, not only was everybody more happy and more confident and trustful in the financials, we added 6 figures of value back to the private practice owner. So there is an all-around increase of confidence, efficiency, and just trust in getting those financials accurate. So what I wanted to do is say, hey, for the first time in I think the history of optometry, 4eyes, myself, my staff is bringing that extra level of accuracy and confidence to bookkeeping. And as the person who I was working with in this deal recently said in a recent chat that we were talking about, that person said, accurate bookkeeping is critical. So when you listen to Ben, when you listen to Natalie, when you listen to the panelists, and y'all can disagree with me if you want, and I'm open-minded about this, but I truly, truly believe that accurate financials, accurate bookkeeping is critical in bringing all these numbers so that all parties can trust and represent themselves properly. So with that, I don't want to take up too much time. You do see my contact information down there. If you do want to get a hold of me, whether you're considering a PE sale, whether you just want to get your books in order, whether you can't understand what your profit and loss looks like, if whatever you want to do to get your business to communicate with you properly, properly with real world numbers, that's basically what we're doing right now. So with that, like I said, I don't want to take up too much time. I appreciate the time that I had here. Happy Memorial Day weekend to everybody. Thank you, ODOF. And if there's anything else, I'll be in the chat and you can mention me.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Wade. That was great content. And once again, scan that QR code there if you're interested in getting connected with Wade. He's fantastic. He's helped out quite a few ODs on our platform, so, and they've all had rave reviews about him. So thank you, Wade. All right, and with that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into the roundtable. So I'm going to do a few brief introductions, and then Natalie is going to take the floor and kind of run the show from there. So first of all, let's introduce Natalie. Natalie Hayes grew up with a broad exposure to unique challenges and opportunities experienced by optometrists. She's the daughter of Jerry Hayes OD. She worked at eDoctor during its startup years and later served on the advisory board of HMI Buying Group and Redtray. Her brother Nathan Hayes is a well-known optometric consultant with iDoc and served at Prima Eye Group in the same capacity. Natalie is now combining her lifelong knowledge of optometry with her advanced training as a certified financial planner and certified valuation analysis to offer a comprehensive financial planning, practice valuation, and investment management service for practice owners, employed optometrists, and their families. And so Natalie is going to be leading it. We do have a couple panelists, and we are so excited to have this kind of all-star panel. Of course, you already met Ben, and he gave this fantastic 1-hour lecture that had a lot of great content, by the way. In addition to Ben, we also have David Roth, and David Roth has been around for 46 years. He gives legal, tax, and business planning expertise to his Louisville, Kentucky law firm, David Roth, PLLC. And one area in which Mr. Roth has focused during the last few years has been representing optometrists with respect to the sale of their practices to several private equity firms and strategic buyers. So he's going to give some of his expertise in that field. And additionally to David, we also have Ann Kavanaugh. She's an experienced financial and strategic advisor with CEO, business development, investment banking, and board of directors expertise. And she's demonstrated significant success in leading, managing, growing, financing, restructuring, and undertaking strategic opportunities for publicly and privately held companies. So her major focus includes retail, consumer products, and healthcare. And in addition to those individuals, we also have two doctors that have actually sold to private equity on here. We first have Robert Allen, who had 10 practices in the Washington, D.C., Virginia area and sold to My Eye Doctor. And then we have Raymond Brill, who has a fantastic, large 7,000 square foot practice and recently sold to AEG. So they're going to provide their perspectives. And we had one other individual who actually practices 2 blocks down from my house right here in Mountain View. And she actually sold to VSP Ventures 2 weeks ago. I tried to get her on and she was going to come on, but then she realized that it's a little too soon to jump on here. But I just want to share what she had to say. And basically she said this: I have nothing fabulously glowing to say about VSP Ventures, nor dark. The experience so far is pretty normal, pretty neutral. So that was her opinion on it. And with that being said, Natalie, I'm going to have you take the floor. Go ahead and shoot those Q&As out and then all the other content you have. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen and we're just going to have a standard roundtable here. So everyone, if you can unmute yourselves and turn your video on, and we'll get started.
Great. Thank you so much, Aaron. It's everyone who's here on Sunday of Memorial Day weekend. Either you're really interested in this, like everyone on the panel is, or you have hopefully fun plans after this. But I wanted to say one thing on bookkeeping. I will talk about this until I'm blue in the face, but good bookkeeping will make any sale, whether that's private equity to another OD, it will make it infinitely better. So if you have an inkling that something like this might be in your future, do it now. Wade will beg you to do it now. It's very, very painful to do at the last minute. It's worth the investment. I know it costs money, but it's worth it. So I'm actually, there's some really great questions. I've sent our panelists some questions. I'm going to try to shift around between those who have sold to private equity and those who are intimately involved in the transactions. And I want to note, David Roth only does private equity transactions in the optometric space, and Kavanaugh Consulting is, in my mind, the broker in the space. I've worked on many of these deals, and I have not actually worked with another broker. So I do want to note that they are the experts in this space, and their perspective is going to be really indicative of what's really going on. But I'm going to start with my last question first, because a couple things came up in Dr. Chudner's discussion that are worth thinking about. And that is, where do we think private equity is going? How long does this, and if you had asked me this, David and I had a webinar a year ago almost today, and we put a 12 to 18 month time frame on it. So we'll have to see how we're living up to that. But how long does this last, these multiples that are in activity that we see going on? And I wanted to start with David on that question and really ask Ann and Dr. Chudner what they think as well.
Thank you, Natalie. It's a pleasure to be here today. I believe that it is an ever evolving landscape. And as Dr. Chudner mentioned, there are new players that are coming into the market, both private equity and strategic in combination, that will extend that period. The question isn't, I think, how long they'll be buying. The question is, how long will the pricing stay up at the levels that we are currently seeing, which are extraordinary. Ann Cavanaugh is a specialist in this, and I think she'll probably agree when she chimes in that seeing pricing at the levels that we're seeing today is amazing. You compare it to other businesses on the block, and you say, my gosh, why are people paying these prices? And when you ask yourself that question, the answer is, for how long will they do it? Because it is extraordinary. That's where we get into, it's probably more than 18 months now with all the players that are in it. But as the consolidators begin to consolidate, as the market is cherry picked, pricing will come down, and that will not be good for the doctors that wish to sell. So I have to agree with Dr. Chudner that now is a good time to sell. The only thing I would mildly disagree with him on is that I don't think that a doctor who has a desire to practice for more than 10 years should say, gosh, I probably shouldn't sell now. And the reason for that is what you mentioned, Natalie, and that is that the opportunities are now, and the risks coming forward in the optometry space, I think really are a factor that you need to take into account. Where will sales come from for your retail optical shops in the future? Will the internet displace a lot of your income? So those are the kinds of things that I would get into and look into further.
Ann, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think there's a first mover advantage, right? And I think right now multiples are super high. And so, and also the equity opportunity with the different consolidators is good. We have had clients that sold to my eye doctor and ECP that made 100% of their sale price on the stock, and also up to 50% of their purchase price. So the equity opportunity can't be dismissed. Kepler and AAG, I think, are probably going to sell in the next like 18 months or so. So I think there's still a good opportunity with them. But even with my eye doctor, I think ultimately they'll go public, and hopefully they'll have the same success like that National Vision did when KKR brought them public. So for sure, there's a couple. So everybody should be looking at selling now because multiples are at the highest, and you reinvest it in the equity opportunity with the buyers, right? The second thing is that recent VSP rule changes prohibiting the buyers to having too much market share. So we represented a group of 7 doctors, it was 8. One of the doctors decided not to sell, and it was in Texas. And we did it as a joint and several. So we sold them as a group and got a platform multiple. And the remaining doctor decided not to sell. So 6 months later, he decided that he should sell. And the buyer that bought the 7 has been told by VSP that because of the concentration, they can't buy. So people are not that interested to buy one-off practices as they are for groups of practices. And that's why we try to get groups of doctors in states so that we can command the best multiple for everybody. But
So-
and I think Rob Allen is the perfect person to talk to the 10 years because he's super young. We represented him, and you know, I think Rob is gonna highly intellectual in terms of how he approached the process.
Yeah, and I would
If
say,
Rob's
you
on.
know, the 10-year piece is it just gives you other things to think about, right? I think the metrics become different, but I agree with both what Ann and David said is the reinvestment piece cannot be discounted. You know, as far as how long this will last, the way we look at it on the inside is there's varying levels of private equity groups. So Kepler and AEG are the two of the big ones now, the big four, although VSP is gaining rapidly, that haven't sold yet. We have not traded yet. So we're still with our original investment group. So our investment group is a smaller investment group and they have an EBITDA target, right? So, you know, whether that be a $30 to $50 million business, that's typically where they want to live. They're going to look for that investment group that is going to take a practice from 50 to 100 million. I think you keep laddering up, and you saw that with my eye doctor. It's traded multiple times. And so I think that there's still room for the smaller ones to continue trading up to the larger private equity groups. I mean, I can tell you without divulging too much, the profitability in our practices are growing year over year in high double digits, not the gross receipts, the actual profit, EBITDA. So this investment is a very, very strong investment. And so I think 18 months is short. I do think that, you know, Kepler and AEG are probably the next two to sell. I do think, and I think Ann kind of approached two of the other questions we see. So I'm just going to quickly comment on them. The piece about my doctor's relationship with VSP and market share limitations is not limited. It is not limited to my eye doctor. It's all of us, right? VSP can tell us that if we have too high of a market share in a particular market, that when we purchase them, they will no longer be able to be credentialed with VSP, which makes them not attractive to us, which is what has allowed us to move into Massachusetts as an example, because my doctor has way too much saturation there. It happened in Texas with Ann. And then the other thing that brought up is who else can buy private equity was another question that came up. Who's going to buy these big groups? And I think Ann has it. I think IPO is certainly an attractive offer for people. And so that may be one option, but I can tell you VSP Ventures has a ton of money. SO Luxottica has a ton of money. So at some point, some of these groups may end up there. It'll depend. And I think when you look at the groups, there are some that are more likely to end up there because their model matches their model, right? VSP has taken right now a very a bespoke model where it's not a centralized, I mean, they have some centralized processes, but the practices are all individual. Whereas Team Luxottica has done the same, but we believe their intention is eventually to kind of standardize that. So some groups are more primed to go to a model like a Team Vision or VSP Ventures, and others aren't. So I don't think the end is near. I do think the time is right. I think the prices are highest. You know, that you're going to see the highest multiples now than what you're going to see in 2 years. But I think there's still plenty of opportunity and a lot of runway.
And Dr. Brill, Dr. Allen, do you have anything you want to add to this discussion about how long private equity is going to be going at its current steam?
Well, I just tell you that I agree with Ben. I like to say the music is playing, and it's the equation is multiple times money, and you get a high multiple, low money. Right now, you're getting high money, high multiple. So I fear the 10-year window. Not to pick on you, Ben, just a little bit, but that was something we really calculated. It's my prediction, and a lot of people I work with on the industry side, that these practices are going to decline in value severely, and the smaller practices, to make the point that the aggregation is much better, but the smaller practices are going to be left high and dry, and they're just going to lock the doors. Retirement will be closing the doors. ODs graduate from school right now with more than $225,000 in debt, on average. They have no ability to buy practices unless they're family financed or whatnot. So, to tie that up, I just think that, it's very unpredictable. David made the point that the industry pressures or the pressures in the business are growing, both through government regulation. I'm not very concerned about online. To quote Jim Sandifer in 2016, that this is the biggest threat to probably retail optometry rather than medically oriented private practices. There's a little bit shipping in the sales there, but mostly it's government and business, changes that are really going to drive this. So now is the time, I believe.
Perfect. Dr. Brill, anything to add or?
Well, everything was said so well. I'm glad to be among the group here with Ben, who I went to AEG and used David Roth and also Kavanaugh Consulting. So it looks like my team was a really good team here. And thank you for all of you. It's interesting. Online discussions think like you sold out instead of like, no, you sold. And you sold out, meaning like you now are Walmart. And instead of saying, no, you calculated your exit strategy, and I'm 2 years from retirement and been with AEG for about a year. So you have to calculate everything. And for example, if someone offered, if your house is worth $600,000, he said, nah, I don't like the buyer. I'll offer it to somebody else for $300,000. I think, no, that's crazy. You would never do that. So for criticism of PE sellers like me, I think that the considerations have to be, a lot of it has to be personal. What are you going to do? Can you find somebody in Kansas? Sometimes there's only 11 to 20 new graduates out there who do not have the resources or the experience to buy a larger practice like I have. So the question will be, what will happen after AEG or Kepler sells, and what will happen to all those senior docs who now have exited, both from the experience and the perspective, and probably AEG will fill, or all the PEs will fill that in, but that's the question. And then you have to consider the risks, how dependent we all are on SLUX, VSP for insurances, and the trends that are away from more personalized care. So, and government regulation. So making a decision, I think you have to be really prepared for change. And if you're not prepared for change and willing to accept management, that would be more difficult, especially for somebody who tends to be like a control freak. Don't laugh, Ben. So I think you have to be really do some personal considerations as well as market considerations. And if you could do that and reconcile, really, this is the best option at the time. I think that PE is really great for a lot of practices. I think it's the best thing I've ever done. So it made a lot of sense, and we have to consider our exits. And a lot of doctors, senior docs, are not considering their exit. And the main thing is they don't realize that not making a decision is making a decision. And you hate for somebody to go because they have a heart attack or a stroke or cancer or some other tragic event in their life, and now their practice is worth nothing.
Well, I want to circle back to something that we keep saying, but I don't think it's been explained really, really clearly on what it is, and that is the equity portion of a sale. And I wish I had kept a graph of what this looks like, because sometimes groups offer a lot of equity and sometimes they offer a little and sometimes they don't offer any at all, and it changes over time. And so I was hoping we could explain what equity is in a really, really easy to understand format. And then I want to say, as the financial planner on the call, when my clients take equity, and I always encourage them to take a little bit of equity, I call it their lottery ticket, and we do not integrate it into their long-term forecast. So it is, I think it's a valuable thing to do. I think it has a lot of upside potential, but I worked in finance in 2008, and I can assure you it could be a while or it could be not at all. So, so that I just wanted to put that 2 cents on there as the conservative person in that department. But Dr. Chudner, since you're on that side of things, can you explain kind of what this equity means?
Sure. Yeah. So we actually want our sellers to invest a portion of their proceeds into our organization, because that gives them additional buy-in, right? It makes them a part of the company. So I'm not as familiar, and probably David and Ann are much more familiar, the actual percentages that get invested. But what I can tell you is a percentage of your proceeds for the sale of your practice can be reinvested as equity. So for example, if you're getting $1 million and you invest 20% of your proceeds, you would be investing $200,000 into our organization or any of the other private equity groups. And at that point, the value of that equity is shown, right? They have to tell you what that's worth. So without giving you numbers, they would target each unit at a certain dollar amount, and you're buying $200,000 worth of those private equity units at that dollar amount. So if they're worth $1 at the time, you're getting 200,000 units. If they're worth $2 at the time, you're getting 100,000 units. When the private equity group sells, if you bought in at $1 a unit and they sell at $5 a unit, well, actually they'll sell it 18 times multiple. And then after all the debt is paid off and serviced, then there's a return. And let's say that's 5 times. Each share is now worth $5 instead of $2. You've now made an additional $3 per unit that you owned or that you reinvested. So, I mean, you're right. You don't know when that's going to happen. I would tell you for some of the groups, it's much more a smaller timeline than others. But it will happen. That will be worth something.
And as you said, Dr. Chudner, the pricing will change over time. So as a company, a buyer becomes more mature, has more companies in their portfolio, the pricing of each unit will go up because the whole company as a whole is getting bigger and has more value. And your percentage in the company for a dollar investment will be smaller. But as that company continues to grow, the entire pie gets larger. And even though your percentage may get smaller, the value of your interest goes up. So it's an algebraic equation. The units get what's called mark to market on a regular basis, depending on the buyer and how often they do that. Quite often it's quarterly, but sometimes more often. But it is a way to get in on the ground floor of an investment that you couldn't get into in the public markets before it actually sells to somebody else at the higher EBITDA. So in terms of the percentage, most companies will give you a range that you're allowed to invest if they are a company that offers equity. Companies such as VSP, which is a nonprofit, would not offer that. But that percentage, I typically ask my clients if they go to Las Vegas, do they play craps or blackjack? And in determining the percentage that they're going to buy, say from a range from 5% to 15%, I would say that they would go to the smaller range, 5 to 10%, if they're blackjack players, or 15% or sometimes more if the buyer will allow it if you're a craps player. But as Natalie mentioned, it's all gravy to the deal because it's not in your pocket until that sale occurs. Ann is an expert on that, so I defer to her on that as well.
Yeah. So on Wall Street, what they call it is not the lottery, but schmuck insurance. So you don't want to be the only person that didn't take stock and then have it trade for big multiple. So we had a client in Tennessee. He was older, about to retire in like a year or two, and he was reluctant to take stock. And I said, look, just take 10%. I think MVD is going to sell very near term. They were owned at the time by Altus Capital. And he made, so he actually put in a little bit more. He made double his money in 6 months. That's a very good return. Now, the way I like to look at the opportunity for equity is I think about there's more upside. Why is there more upside? There's always more upside when there's more risk, right? So they're not as traded. So iCare Partners went from FFL to Partners Group out of Switzerland. Okay, so the next exit is going to be probably 3 to 5 years from now. Okay, MED, I think, they went from, they started off with Monitor Clipper, went to Altus Capital out of Canada. Now they're with Goldman Sachs. So what I would look at if I'm selling to is what is that private equities firm average return on capital? So Goldman Sachs average return on capital is 2 times. So if I sell the MED, if they historically every portfolio company is 2 times, then that's more likely. Imperial Capital, which is Kepler, their historical return has been 4 to 5 times. And then I don't know what Partners Group is, but those are the things that you should ask as a seller. Like, I'm going to invest some of my money, whether it's 5% is the most expensive form of capital, went from starting off at 20% and then went to 10, went to 5, then didn't offer stock for a while, then went back up. So it's all a negotiation, and it's a risk return profile. Everybody has a different risk return profile. I have another client, he sold and he invested everything in real estate. He's done really well too. So it depends on your risk return, but I always like to have somebody, really somebody that take a little bit of equity.
Awesome. I'm going to interject real quick because our Q&A is starting to load up and I know Natalie can't see it. So I'm just going to shoot a few questions out and then Natalie, I'll let you take over again. One individual asked, what is considered an average large practice from a gross revenue standpoint? Just if you want to throw some numbers out there for reference for everyone.
I think 5 million is a large practice. And again, valuation is a combination of size. So a platform company like somebody like Rob Allen is going to trade at a much higher multiple than a single OD, $1 million practice. So size matters, number of locations matter, profitability matters, consistency of revenue growth, consistency of profitability, the state that you're in. Like some states are very pro-business. You get paid a lot more in Georgia, Virginia, DC, Texas than you do, say, Ohio, which the economy is much more stagnant.
All right, and we're getting quite a few questions on non-compete clauses. So if you can comment on that, how long are they? How large are they? Obviously, we've got representation from different private equity firms here, so that'd be great.
I can comment. So there are 2 different types of non-competes to think about. So there's the non-compete for the purchase of the practice, which is not subject to employment law. So those are going to be not only much more enforceable, but they can be much more strict. So I will tell you, I'll speak in terms of my team. Ours are typically 5 years and 25 miles for the APA. So that one is not contingent on employment. That is from the date the practice is sold. So if you sold today, it would end 5 years from today, that one, no matter if you worked for the practice or not. And then there's the employment agreement, and those really can be all over the place, and that is subject to employment law. So you have to follow the rules of the state. So it has to be reasonable in length, reasonable in radius. So we do anywhere from 12 to 24 months, and I've seen anywhere from really 3 miles to 10 miles on average, depending. We have some that are much higher in rural areas, but that's in general, and those are different. And that one, if you go beyond the 5 years of the APA and you continue working for the practice, that one's still in effect because that's a part of your employment agreement.
But in some cases, some of those are not even enforceable. But you have to keep in mind, almost every buyer, in fact, every buyer that I've seen will insist upon having both types of non-competes, one in the asset purchase agreement, one in the employment agreement. And even if the one in the employment agreement is not enforceable, it is a lever to hold over the head of a doctor, because most doctors don't want to be the ones going into court to argue that something is unenforceable. So in effect, even though it may be legally unenforceable, it is practically enforceable simply because of its weight. So you've got to take that into account in making your decisions. And the areas can be negotiated. 25 is rule of thumb that we see quite often, but in more densely populated areas, it is sometimes possible to negotiate a lower mileage, such as 10, 15, something like that.
We've gotten a couple fives.
Yeah, rare occasion, but true.
And yeah.
Great. And then the Q&A section's blowing up. Sorry, Natalie. We will get to your questions. I know you have some really good ones for the panel. A really good one actually in the Q&A. What are the 4 biggest changes that PE makes in its first year to drive up revenue in practices it acquires? And can't smaller practices or doctors also make those changes for themselves? Where's the separation there?
I think the short answer is yes. There's lots that a optometrist can do, but there's so much more that they can't do, right? So I think we think in terms of synergies. Probably the biggest, most disruptive change that we are going to make is the point of sale and the EHR. So many of us are obligated through our contracts to use a very specific EHR system and a point of sale system. And many of us are required to make that change within the first 90 days, although we're not always held to that. So that's definitely one change that will happen. If you are not on the PE firm's required point of sale and EHR, that will change. You may see a name change depending. So we've purchased practices that have franchise names. If you have Vision Source in your name, or if you're part of TSO or Today's Vision, for example, those names are not transferable. So the name will change in that situation. You will probably lose some employees. So if you have a huge HR department or a huge billing department, you will probably lose those employees as well. And then I think the other biggest change is your paycheck now has a different name on it. But I think I'm curious to hear the other panelists, but I will tell you where we have the advantage is we are essentially a very, very large buying group. And so where we can increase profitability is a lot of it is on cost of goods. And not only on initial cost of goods, but there's a lot of back end deals that we can make. So contact lens companies throw tons of money to us on the back end in the form of rebates that we just are much larger than what you can get. And so your practice will always be more valuable to us than it is to anybody else outside of the private equity world, because we can pull levers that they just can't. And cost of goods is a big one, but obviously advertising is another one that we do that they can't. Sorry, I lost my screen here. So I'll stop and let you guys talk.
Ben, let me interject a question to you and follow up to that I think listeners may want to hear. When you talk about reduction of staff, doctors are very protective of their staff, and they like to see people continue in their positions. And it's been my experience that with the smaller firms, if you don't have a very, very large firm that has, as you said, a department of people that handle things, it's less likely that there will be changes. And I see in small to medium practices virtually no change in the staffing, and certainly not for some time after the closing to let the dust settle. But even after that, I see the buyers continue the staff in place. So a seller, an OD that's thinking about selling doesn't have to panic that all of a sudden his or her staff is going to be decimated. I've just not seen that.
No, and decimated would definitely not be the word I'd use. And the other option is where you may lose staff, they join us. So we've taken on a biller in a practice and put them on our billing team, and they work remotely through our billing team. So when I say you're going to lose staff, it doesn't mean they're going to lose their job. I probably should be more clear about that, because I agree, doctors are very, very, very protective, and as they should be. And I will tell you, the one thing I can say in every deal that I've been involved with, and you guys have seen this as well, in every single one, whether it's the doctor or associate doctor or associates in general, they have either been made whole, but almost always have a better situation, whether it's the benefits are better, the pay is slightly better, whatever it is. I've never seen an associate, whether doctor or non-doctor, optician, front desk, whatever it is, end up with a worse contract or a worse compensation package after acquisition than they had before.
Right.
And Anne can speak to this a little more. I think AG especially has been good with my clients on this, but if there is someone who's going to lose their job, usually the owner knows in advance and they know why and they know what the options are. They're really upfront about that. They're not going to surprise you on the back end.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And I just want to point out a number of our clients, larger clients, who had really good office managers in particular, and the office manager always feels a little vulnerable. So recently, the office manager who was super nervous got a big regional promotion. And then another one, again, not regional, but district manager promotion. So there's also opportunity. And then a husband was relocated for one of the employees that worked for a practice, and the PE firm was able to take and relocate that person within their network. So there's benefits to, you know, having a large owner as well. And the benefits is a big plus as well. So no one likes change. And that's why we always tell our clients to not say a word to ODs that are employed until 2 weeks before, and oftentimes the staff the day before, because change makes people nervous, but change also can bring opportunity. And I think people lose sight of that.
And this is actually a really good time because we haven't given them a lot of airtime yet. But Dr. Brill, Dr. Allen, why don't, from your perspective, being on the other side of the table, what changes have you seen, 6 months in, 1 year into a practice sale?
First of all, I want to address the staff. We have not lost any staff members. We've actually added staff members. And I'm surprised how well they all adapted to the change, which was mainly change in the EHR and in the practice management system. So they've adapted quite well, much better than I thought they would. And to the other changes, having actual practice manager instead of myself. My wife works in the practice too, so there was been no attempt to really split up the family, so to speak. And I think that everybody's pretty happy. They've got strict rules on benefits. They have retirement plan, things that were above what we could do. While we provided medical and retirement, we were too small really to offer a dental plan. And now those that had a simple IRA, they just rolled it into their 401k. So it's been more corporate and maybe less loosey-goosey than I did, but they've adapted really well.
Yeah, and I would say that that's the same here. We've had a couple self-select out, which having 10 offices and 130, 140 employees, I mean, you have a big variation. But most are here and with us and have done really well through the transition. Actually, very proud of the staff, how they had the announcement a few weeks before close and actually did very, very well with it. Agree with what Ben said as well, that the benefits packages, the compensation, we were very generous with these things. And MED has actually exceeded us. Everybody has a better situation as far as compensation and whatnot than they had with us, and we were very good, and we paid very well. I do want to say that I also worked with Ann for years, and then David, and they both were instrumental in that process and making sure that happened. And we took care of our employees and our associate ODs. So that's what we saw.
Natalie, can I interject one question that's been popping up a lot? And then I just put an announcement. We'll run the panel to about 11:15. So after this question, Natalie will take over. We'll do our raffle at 11:15. Be done with our day, but a lot of good comments from the panel. So a question that's been popping up a lot, we've been sending you guys kind of straight fastballs, but this one's going to be a curveball. Do you feel that PE is hurtful to the profession of optometry? A lot of young ODs out there wanting to buy, they've just graduated. Like Ben said, they have the debt. It's hard to get in. Is this leading our profession down the wrong path? Are we forcing people out of entrepreneurship that might have wanted to join into entrepreneurship because of PE? And I'd like to hear the doctor's perspective and also David and Ann's perspective as well.
Well, I guess I'll lead that one. Look, business is business. Okay. I mean, I've spent, all my professional career also working in professional optometry and state and national level. So I'm very sensitive to, the opportunities for ODs and the profession, and have a very clear picture of where I'd like to see it go, which is a much more medical direction. I think that's very important to the future of the profession. That being said, this is a business, and we take jobs to support ourselves and our families and do the right things by them and our staff and our associate ODs. So making these business decisions, PE has offered a tremendous opportunity. When I started my practice back in 1999, there was no PE. The exit strategy was hopefully you find an associate or a partner to sell to. PE made that the retirement options and the transition options much, much better and much cleaner. So I don't see PE as a threat to the profession at all. I believe entrepreneurship can certainly thrive and survive. It's an option. It's an option for those that own their practices and whatnot. There's a transition within each business. Businesses grow, professions grow, and there's change. And it's how you adapt to that change that determines your success or failure. So I'm a fan of PE. So.
I think that if the question is, are we limiting opportunities for new graduates to open practices? Well, if you consider things in a SWOT analysis, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, if you actually do that, a new business savvy, clinical savvy optometrist that wants to start a private practice, there are advantages for small practices. They can move quickly. They don't have to consider every decision on an enterprise level. They can relate to buying relationships. They can outsource to a number of revenue cycle management companies or insurance processing. So they can actually limit, all the knowledge that they need to or glean that from other companies. But they can develop their professional skills in terms of all the hot topics, whether it's dry eye, myopia management, specialty contact lenses, or high-end optical. So they can do all of that. They will just need probably some consultation, and they will need to be considerate of undertaking risk. And I've never been afraid of risk, and we always try to be 5 years ahead of everyone. So I think there's all sorts of opportunities. For example, I don't know of any city that has an all-night optometrist. If somebody did that in Chicago or even Kansas City, there'd be people that say, man, I want to go at 10 o'clock at night or at midnight. So there are all sorts of ways to be creative and not limit, we call it entrepreneurship, but entrepreneurship.
Yeah, I think the other thing is you have to look at optometry is evolving the way physical therapy, dermatology, dentistry, which PE is way ahead in terms of its acquisition. And the other thing, choice, like in 2012, my eye doctor was the only buyer. Now you've got 12 to 15 active buyers. For an optometrist, you have the choice. And to me, that's power. So you have the power now, whereas before you were selling to an associate OD for 50% less than PE. So everybody has a choice. They can stay independent. They can make that decision, or they can monetize their life's work at a very high valuation right now based on the PE interest. So I think choice is good.
So, and I see it like all you guys said, but if you look at where some of the pain points are for private practice, I'll use OCT or threshold visual fields because right now that's something I'm dealing with quite a bit. They're very, very expensive devices. There's some newer, less expensive options out there now, but you're talking about a $30,000 to $40,000 device for an OCT that reimburses on average, through normal reimbursement, about $42 bilaterally, right? And every single practice thinks they need to have one in every single location. And there's lots of examples of these things where optometrists are taught to practice a certain way, I don't want to knock our schools, but, from people who are not in practice, and so they've never had to run a practice. And so you guys are, Aaron and Dad, you understand this, right? There's a lot of expenses that goes into owning and running a practice. I'm not talking about patient care. I'm talking about the business side of this, right? And so when you build scale in a market and an OCT angiography device comes out, you can place that in a market and have every single one of your practices have access to that without having to buy 10 in that market. And so there's some opportunities actually, in my opinion, to elevate the care that's being provided in private practice with these models. Now, right now, we're in a really good spot. My Eye Doctor, Kepler, Eye Care Partners, AEG, all have optometry that are intimately involved in the clinical strategy of these businesses. I mean, I can't speak to some of the other entities, but I sit on the executive leadership team on the same level as our vice president of operations, right? We both report to the same COO. So as far as how we look at how we run the business, I'm at the same level as the people that are making the decisions on what glasses we sell, what frames we put in there, and what kind of how we're going to do the operations of the non-clinical side. And so as long as you have optometrists in these positions, which may or may not be forever, but I actually think this could be a positive thing and push the level of care that we see in these practices higher than they could have done on their own. And that's where I see some of the advantages of this.
And I'd like to take this from a very opposite perspective. I really think there's always going to be a place for private practice. Maybe it's not your really standard optometric practice, single doctor. It'll be hard to compete, but with specialized care or high end, there will always be a place. So it's like any other market, you need to find your place, but this is not the end of private practice optometry. And I come from a family of private practice optometry. This is not the end.
And Natalie, couldn't agree with you more. This is an option. And, it's, to those that want to start a practice, just do your research, make sure you've studied the market. Don't make mistakes. I mean, these are the same mistakes we could have made 20, 30, 40 years ago. And if you do the research, you study the market, you look at the needs and opportunities, I think you'll be very successful. And then, hey, PE is another option for your exit. So it's kind of the circle. So
it's similar to the philosophical and the reality that's happened in the pharmaceutical or the pharmacy market, that you have compounding pharmacies and people that are doing very unique types of things that are still independent, but your normal course pharmacist is probably working for Walgreens or CVS or some other larger company. And whether people like it or not, it's inevitable to happen in the optometry field at this point, with as many players as are active in the industry. So you either will need to specialize if you want to be independent, or recognize that you're going to have a very limited practice with limited upside if you're going to try to be a generalist, I think.
Yeah, I think, David, you actually hit on probably the biggest point. That's the difference between when, probably Dr. Brill and myself started, Dr. Brill, you may have been a little bit before me, but regardless, there was a time where you could just throw a shingle out and, the success was almost guaranteed. Now you have to be much more innovative, entrepreneurial, look for those opportunities in the market where you can be different. To the point, the 24-hour optometrist, that's an interesting one to me. That's and I'll tell you something, in our market in Northern Virginia, DC, that really could, with the millions of people we have here, maybe New York Metro, same thing. You got those night owls, and they don't want to wait in line, and they don't want to be in a busy office. So that would, I think you make a great point. That's what you need to do as the new practice OD versus what we had to do, which was pretty much just knitting.
And just to be clear, I've never heard a single private equity group that has been promoting 24-hour optometry. So that is not something that'll change if you sell to private equity. Just want to put that out there.
Well, that was
I happen to know that Rob Allen is a very late night person, as am I. So we would probably be customers of that.
So if anyone starts 24-hour optometry and becomes a multimillionaire, remember, you've heard it here first. So.
I'll take a commission on that. So.
Yeah, and I'll say, you know, and I do want to add here too, because David was our attorney, and the ability to talk to David that late at night was actually pretty instrumental. So David, I thank you for that.
Likewise.
Yeah, I was just creating that as an example. But,
Yeah.
you know, there are things that made big businesses successful, like delivery of pizza in 15 minutes. Now, it was bad pizza, but you got it in 15 minutes until there were two car accidents, and they had to extend that. So, you know, we can always improve our delivery of services, and we can improve delivery of eyewear. We used to drive eyewear to attorneys' offices and adjust it in their conference room. Like, hey, what's that? Who's that? My doctor doesn't deliver my eyewear. So there's all sorts of ways we can improve what I call the patient experience. And nowadays it's all about the image that we portray. It's about our brand, and it's about the user interface essentially and the user experience. And we always can improve the user experience from website presentation and presentation of content. You know, there's all sorts of ways that we can improve things that are not reinventing the wheel, but are just pretty common. But you have to study sometimes other professions and how they do that. And I learned that stuff in my MBA program, but you don't have to be an MBA to figure out what is it you like as a consumer and how do we emulate that? Or what do you don't like, you know, and how do we emulate that? And just look at the highest service providers in any industry and say, how can I do that in my profession?
Awesome. Thank you, Raymond. Natalie, do you want to wrap up? I know we're hitting a little past 11:15 here. So if you have any final closing words or statements.
I just kind of back to the maybe more in the nitty gritty of private equity, but I always warn clients who are about to go through the process that it is a difficult process to go through. And so if anyone here on the call is imminently considering going through the process, I just wanted to just set your expectations, brace yourself on what it looks like before closing and after closing so that you know what you're getting yourself into. And it's not, you get a big paycheck at the end of the day, but that process. So Dr. Allen, Dr. Brill, still a little fresh on your minds, I'm sure. Can you talk through what that process to getting to close looks like, and maybe a little bit about what it looked like on the back end?
Well, I would say that I relied on consultants because I know my weakness, and my weakness is in bookkeeping and accounting. And also, I'm not a lawyer. So I know there's practitioners saying, no, I can do this all myself. We've got really great bookkeeping, accounting. I have a good legal mind. But for me, I had to rely on help, and I was willing to pay for that help. So that was very helpful because I was still seeing patients full time all day long, and I needed really the help. Not that everyone would. So I would say that if you're unfamiliar, you do want to go through this during process, because it's painful because you are dealing with things that you mainly avoided your whole life. You know, a lot of people are not really doing a strict analysis of their finances. You know, you're making good money, you know, you could pay your bills, and that's about as good as you got. Although there are all sorts of programs like Edge and Pekka had a program and all those, but it doesn't get to the point where really the private equities want. They want that detail down to the dollar. So that's what I'd say is use some help if you can, if you need it.
You know, I would couldn't agree more. I would say that I was a little bit unique. We have a professional board, a CFO who's a CPA out of a large audit firm, PwC, and a professional COO who had built a law firm. So we had our transition. There were over 1,000 items of well more than 1,000 items that were requested, and it was handled very professionally and very quickly. And David and Ann were intimately involved in that process. So I also would say that Ann was critical in navigating this for us, both choosing the buyer and assisting us in figuring out who that would be and why, and then leading us to David, who's done over 100 of these deals and is very, very familiar with the process, the buyers, and everything else. This was not his first rodeo, and I've worked with big law firms who all have M&A departments and everything else, and I did not hand them that business because the professional recognized expert is David, and that was how we were able to accomplish this efficiently. So at any rate, but yeah, be prepared. There's just they look into every nook and cranny. They'll ask you questions you had never even thought of, and you'll have to produce all that data. So, and if you don't have, certainly working with professionals such as Ann and David will make your life a lot easier, tremendously easier, and Natalie obviously as well, because good financial assistance, direction, and cleaning up your books is critical. Something you should be doing now. If that's you should always have clean books regardless, because you don't know what the future is going to be. So be prepared for it. But those things are going to be critical to how the process goes, how the outcome goes. And remember, the buyer could learn things that they don't like and pull out.
And Natalie, I do want to say one more thing. So I want to say one more thing. If I were in the mode to buy practices and private practices, and of course I'm not now, and somebody way undervalued their practice, and I think there was an example that was given to me. There's a practice in Chicago. The owner wanted $700,000, but the private equity group was going to offer them $2.2 million. So they're going to be much more fair. I mean, if I were buying a practice, I'd say $700,000. Yeah, how about $500,000? I'll buy for $500, and we'd settle on $600. But the way private equity groups work, at least AEG, is they're going to do it in a fair manner, and you will so you'll be really easily calmed down by the fact that you're not going to be taken advantage of, more like a private practitioner would if they were trying to buy your practice, because they have standards they have to stick up to. And I think while there's some negotiation in the process, there's not as much negotiation as you think, because the numbers are the numbers. And so you can be comfortable in knowing that they're going to do it in a fair and equitable manner. And maybe that's where the equity part comes in there.
I would expand on what Dr. Allen and Dr. Brillo said even further, that it is a continuum, and it predates your decision to sell and continues after the sale in terms of how you approach this entire operation. So you have to look at how do you prepare the books. That goes with the things that the sponsors have talked about. Really resonated with me with Four Eyes and Eric and all the things that they do, and what Natalie does in terms of planning and getting everybody in line. And then you bring in a person like Ann Kavanaugh, who can take what is there and scrub it and really get it in order before it all goes to the buyer. And that's that preparation is what helps the process be a lot more orderly once you start with a particular buyer and go through the due diligence and disclosure processes. So it is a continuum of care, I would say, that you have to think about way in advance of selling, and when you get people involved to help you, if you don't have them already on staff like Dr. Allen had.
Yeah, it's already, if you start cleaning up your books when you begin this process, it's already too late. And you're way down the road. So clean them up now and work with professionals. And I'll tell you, I don't think people should consider working without a broker such as Ann. And I think Ann is I did a lot of research before I worked with Ann, and she has a whole team behind her, and we were prepared to go to market before we went to market.
Yeah.
And thanks.
They do their homework. They do their homework to make the process go orderly.
All right, everyone. Well, I want to thank the whole panel for being here. Especially want to send a special thank you to Natalie. I know there was a lot of coordination to get this panel together today, especially on a holiday weekend. So David, Ann, Robert, Ray, and Ben, I really appreciate you all coming on today. Fantastic conversation. I know the audience learned a lot. There was a lot going on in the Q&A and chat. Also want to thank our sponsors, so Parita Patel Health Insurance, Acrinos and Eric Matai, and also Wade and Four Eyes Bookkeeping. And all three of these are very much needed when you go through the PE process. That's why we have these sponsors on today. And before we sign off, we are going to do a quick raffle for the $100 Amazon gift card. And I believe I have the result here, and it is Joy Bate, who has been active in the chat as well. So Joy, you just won a $100 Amazon gift card, so feel free to email us, admin@ODsonFinance.com, to claim that. All right, well, it is coming up on 11:30. I want to be respectful of everyone's time this weekend. So once again, thank you everyone for tuning in. I know there's gonna be a lot of people that are gonna watch a replay of this because it's the holiday weekend. But appreciate you coming. And once again, Natalie, thank you for organizing a great panel. Ben, thank you for giving a lecture and then sitting on the panel as well. And panelists as well, thank you for taking time out of your days.
Thank
you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, we are signing off. Everyone have a great Memorial Day, okay? Take care.
Happy Memorial Day
Thank
weekend.
you.
Happy Memorial Day.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.